greetings and welcome to the Research to Practice Transit Symposium for 2022. I am your host and moderator for today. My name is Chad Riding, and I am from the California Department of Transportation's, or Caltrans. This symposium is brought to you as an effort by Caltrans, the University of Florida Transportation Institute, the T-Score University Transportation Center, the American Public Transportation Association, or APTA, and the Mineta Transportation Institute, based at San Jose State University. So we have a great lineup for you today. We are going to start with our program. We're pleased to hear from Brian Taylor, a professor of urban planning and public policy at the Luskin School of Public Affairs and director of the Institute of Transportation Studies at UCLA. I will be moderating that discussion. We will follow that with a 15-minute break, and please note that all of these times are Eastern. At 1:15 p.m. Eastern, we will have a presentation on fare collection and payment options. Our speaker will be Jillian Gillette, Program Manager of the California Integrated Mobility Program at Caltrans. I will also moderate that session. We will have a 15-minute break, which will be followed by a presentation beginning at 2:15 on Vermont and California's experience with zero fare transit with Adam Barth and Ross McDonald. Adam is from the Stanislaus County, California Regional Transit Authority. He is the CEO there. Ross McDonald is the Public Transit Program Manager at the Vermont Agency of Transportation. That will be followed by a 30-minute break, returning at 3:30 p.m. Eastern for a lively debate on zero fare transit, pros and cons. Our speakers will be Joshua Schenk, a managing principal at InfraStrategies, and Greg Newmark, professor of regional and community planning at Kansas State University. Our moderator will be Andy Furlow from Caltrans. The program can be viewed in its entirety, including the bios, at the symposium's website, www.transportation.institute.ufl.edu, and you can find the rest of that here. You can also search for this. Given that you are all joining us by remotely over YouTube, I think this will be a great exercise in finding this online. We'd like to thank our sponsors, again, Caltrans, APTA, University of Florida Transportation Institute, the T-Score University Transportation Center, and the Mineta Transportation Institute. We would like to give a special thanks to the steering committee. Its sponsors are Andy Furlow, Wendy Moran. Wendy was a great help on all of our visual materials. Art Gazzetti, Dave Carroll, both from APTA, David Harris from Florida DOT, Louisa Easter from Caltrans, Greg Newmark from Kansas State, Jacob Yan from University of Florida, Jesus Gomez from the Gainesville Regional Transit in Gainesville, Florida, Kerry Watkins, now at University of California at Davis, Lily Eleftheriadou at University of Florida, Stuart Morey at Caltrans, Balwinder Tarlock at Caltrans, Shile Chow at University of Florida, Hillary Nixon at Mineta Transportation Institute, and me, Chad Riding. And a special thanks to all of today's participants, to our speakers, panelists, and moderators. Brian Taylor, Jillian Gillette, Adam Barth, Ross McDonald, Joshua Schenk, Greg Newmark, Andy Furlow, and Chad Riding. For those of you who are members of the American Institute of Certified Planners, there is certification maintenance credit available. This website will have more information. You can go to planning.org for their AICP page, and you can put in a symposium in the search bar, and that should come up with this event. If you have any panelist questions or technical issues, please feel free to send them to me at chad.writing at dot.ca.gov. And I will endeavor to answer them as soon as possible for any technical issues. And as time allows, forward on those questions to our panelists and presenters. Thank you very much for attending. We're really excited for this great conference. And we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Brian Taylor from UCLA Luskin School. So, Brian, please feel free to share your screen. And we're excited for your plenary address to us.
Okay. So good morning, everyone in the West, and good early afternoon in the East. Again, I'm Brian Taylor. I'm going to talk a little bit about an overview of transit use pricing and finance in the pandemic and coming out of it. So I'm going to do three things today. One, I'm going to talk a little bit about the principal markets for public transit and how they're changing, and that's really important to understand the financial issues that we're facing. Second, I'm going to talk a little bit about how transit use changed during the pandemic. Many of you may have some ideas of that, but I'll try and paint a pretty simple picture of that issue and what the fiscal implications are of these changes. And then finally, looking ahead at transit finance and pricing, I'm going to look at some issues that I think the other panelists are going to be discussing over the course of the day. So first, about those principal markets for transit and how they've been changing in the pandemic. There's two basic markets for public transit. Of course, it's much more nuanced than that. There's a wider variety. But if we break it down to two fundamental levels, we have people who are traveling to places where parking is difficult or expensive. Those are typically the centers of the oldest and largest metro areas, and they're places where the automobile has a bit of a backseat. Walking and transit have all sorts of natural advantages with the environment, and transit use tends to be very high. The second is people who, because of age, income, mobility, have little or no automobile access. Now, it's important to know that in the US, that market number two is far larger than market number one, and that's important for the pandemic. So pre-pandemic, just a bit of data from 2017, transit riders tend to be in big, dense cities, have less car access and lower incomes, and are more likely to be foreign born or younger. And here I'm highlighting that nationwide, about 17% of the population lives in households with incomes below $25,000, but it's about double that or a bit more for public transit users. About 36% come from that. With respect to vehicle access, the issues are even more stark. Only about 5% of US households have no vehicles in them at all. And yet about 46% of all transit riders come from those 5% of the household. So it's a big share of people with limited access to autos. Now, I'm going to zero in on California. I'm going to jump back and forth between some California data and US data. In the decade prior to the pandemic, we essentially saw an erosion of bus ridership across the state. And that isn't because, I'm not going to go into the details, that service was declining, but we did see this gradual erosion that continued. We saw a bit of a renaissance for rail transit up until about 2016 or 17, and then it too started tailing off leading into 2020 and the pandemic. But it really was a tale of two modes. Just to give the Bay Area as an example of the spatial variation in travel, we can see that these are the bus routes and the rail routes of the Bay Area where the widths of the lines are scaled to the numbers of annual passengers. And you can see what an enormous share of all the ridership is in San Francisco, one of the most transit-friendly places in the United States, and then crossing the Bay into Oakland and Berkeley in the East Bay. The blue line down there to the left is Caltrain, and you can see VTA down in San Jose and other systems around the region. So lots of coverage, with the vast majority of riders who are at the center and going in and out of downtown San Francisco. In fact, if you looked at data for BART during that period, we see that much of the Bay Area ridership overall was being propped up by downtown San Francisco trips. In this case, you can look at this is just Trans-Bay BART ridership, and that is that it travels under the tube between Oakland and San Francisco. it actually was climbing quite steeply up until 2016, while all other Bay Area transit ridership, that's on BART and all other sources, was staying flat or declining during that same period. So what we can say is there was a real renaissance, particularly in the Bay Area and California, and again, these are from California research, of trips in and out of downtown San Francisco. So we can say that these, and in fact, riders in the Bay Area were growing more affluent over the 2010s, in part because of the well-educated affluent riders going in and out of downtown San Francisco. So with that as sort of a precursor, how have things changed in the pandemic, and what are the fiscal implications? So first was that first few months, which was horrifying on many levels for many people. We saw early in the pandemic the financial situation for California transit operators appeared dire. In fact, it did for transit operators across the country. Ridership fell about 70% in 3 months, and most agencies suspended fare collection. So we had a forced experiment in fare-free transit that we're going to hear more about later. Many of you have probably seen a graph that looks something like this. We had the tremendous drop in April and into May of 2020, and then a recovery. And this shows the red line for driving, the orange for walking, and the blue for transit. And that with some ups and downs, driving and walking have returned very much to pre-pandemic levels. The patterns are quite different, but the levels are similar. Transit has had some ups and downs as well, but has been very slow in climbing back up to levels that we saw prior to the pandemic. So we really see a very distinct modal difference in this and other travel modes. These are data looking at, digging a little deeper, looking at what went on into the pandemic with changes in ridership. And I paired these two graphs on purpose. They show very different things. On the left is the change in ridership. This is in boardings by census tract in Los Angeles. And light areas that are close to white or gray, had less change, and those that are more maroon had more change. So that's the chart on the left. If you look at the right, that's the distribution of income in Los Angeles County. And on the left is on the light gray or white is less income, and on the dark maroon is higher income. And you can see they're almost interchangeable with one another. And what we saw is a significant decline in boardings among those in higher income areas, and then again in downtown Los Angeles. So there was a very, very strong income component to the changes we saw in the pandemic, which is very different than what I was describing going on in the Bay Area leading up to the pandemic, where we were seeing more riders who were affluent and had and traveling into downtowns. So we saw statewide a collapse in ridership. But actually, in Southern California, where the riders tended to be lower income on average than in Northern California, we saw that the dip wasn't quite as steep, and the recovery has been a bit more robust. So the blue line is patterns in the US. You can see that California is very similar to, that's the gold line, to the US. And then the gray line are the Southern California, the SCAG area and San Diego transit operators. Here's zeroing in a bit more, looking at comparing the two. So this goes from 2008 and into 2021. There we saw, again, that erosion of bus ridership that I was talking about. That's the blue line on the top. One is an annual reporting, the other is monthly data, the dotted line. You can see that was dipping down coming into the pandemic. Then there was a collapse and then a bounce back. With rail ridership, you could see it was fairly flat overall. This is statewide, not just BART. We see it was relatively flat with another collapse and a recovery. But if you look at the slope of the recovery, you can see that the buses were coming back faster than rail. And again, that has to do with the markets that these different modes tend to be serving. Rail riders on commuter rail, LA Metro, BART in Sacramento and San Diego are more likely to be traveling to downtown, where we saw the biggest drop in employment with the rise of work from home, and office centers have been slower to bounce back. Bus riders are more likely to be traveling to a variety of destinations around the metropolitan area. They're more likely to be lower income riders who have less auto access, and their bounce back has been greater. So we sort of see a flipping of the script there. This shows the urbanized areas. That's what a UZA is in California. The largest, or the second largest in the country, is Los Angeles Long Beach. That's the light blue line. So the LA area trips per capita. You can see that it was about staying steady or eroding from a little over 4 to under 4 per month. And then the drop in the pandemic and the recovery. Below that, you see San Diego. Below that, San Jose, and then on down with other urbanized areas in California. Way above all those others is the Bay Area, right? With between 10 and 12 trips per month per capita, much, much higher. And you can see that the drop was much steeper than in the other metropolitan areas. And while ridership per capita is still the highest in the Bay Area, it's much more similar to the rest of the state now. And what that is those affluent riders in the Bay Area have left transit and have been much slower to return. There were fewer, more affluent riders in the other urbanized areas, and as a result, their bounce back has been relatively a bit better. I think this shows the dramatic difference where the Bay Area sits. And of course, again, when we talk about the Bay Area, the vast majority of those riders are in San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley area. So we have a paper coming out looking at comparing Boston, Houston, and Los Angeles between 20 and 21. And I'm not going to go into all the model details, but we compared essentially April of 19 to April of 20, the beginning of the pandemic, October of 19 to October of 20. So we're 7 or 8 months into the pandemic. And then we looked at what explained the change over time. What we found was that in all three of those metropolitan areas, very different, Boston, Houston, and LA are very different places. More densely populated, more centrally located neighborhoods tended to lose more riders. The neighborhoods with more Black residents tended to lose fewer riders. And those with more Latino residents tended to gain more riders back. So what we've seen, again, as I was describing, is that we've seen the recovery much higher in low-income neighborhoods than in big central downtown office areas. And these are neighborhoods that are more likely Black or Latino, and they've tended to bounce back the best over, at least into 2021. So essentially, we're looking at an about face. Before the pandemic, rail transit in the San Francisco Bay Area, with its relatively more affluent riders, fared considerably better than LA and the rest of the Golden State before the pandemic. There was an erosion of ridership around much of the state, but that was really being propped up by the Bay Area, in particular trips into and out of downtown San Francisco. And in general, high fare box recovery systems were tending to perform relatively well, while it was lower fare box recovery systems that were tending to struggle more with riders. But since 2020, rail transit and the Bay Area have fared worse in the pandemic, in part because, or largely because of the loss of the more affluent riders, many of whom had cars available to them, traveling in and out of office centers, while buses in areas with higher proportions of transit-dependent riders have recovered. I don't know why that says Blumberg. I have no idea. More quickly. So it's, I have no idea why that's there. And then lower fare box recovery systems have tended to fare better. So we've really flipped the script on what was some worrisome declines in ridership before the pandemic to ridership declines we're seeing, or declines and then slow recovery in the pandemic. So back to those two principal markets, the people traveling to places where parking is difficult or expensive, they largely vanished at the start of the pandemic and have been very slow to return. Meanwhile, people, because of age, income, or ability, who have little or no auto access, dipped at the start of the pandemic and have substantially returned. So we've really seen the market overall. It means that the average transit rider today is lower income, more likely a person of color, more likely an immigrant than before the pandemic. And that's not because these folks are riding more than they did before the pandemic. It's because other riders are riding so much less. So that means that providing mobility for those without has really become perhaps the central role of public transit over the last 2 years, an incredibly important one. And it's never been greater than really today in serving that important need for core mobility for those without. The future of downtown commuter market remains uncertain, and hybrid and office occupancy densities are still sorting themselves out. And a lot's going to depend on to what extent those major office centers sort of reoccupy over time and whether they re-densify to the levels that we saw previously. So now to turn more of a focus on transit finance and pricing, I want to talk a little bit about work we've been doing at UCLA looking at transit finance in California and the US. We collected transit agency financial data and budgets in California. We analyzed data sets on transit budgets, service, and use across the US. We conducted detailed interviews with transit agency financial staff here in California. We did 2 transit operator surveys, one in the late summer, early fall of 2020, and the other one in the winter of 21-22. So from late November 2021 and into the end of January in 2022, asking about finance issues. And then we have a final report. We published a first report looking at transit finance in Southern California last year. We're doing a statewide study that's going to be due out by the end of the fall. So a little bit about that. We were looking at sort of this existential crisis in 2020. And those of you that are in the industry knew what a nail-biting experience that was. And we saw initial bailouts from the feds and even a concern that that wouldn't be enough. So it's been a tumultuous time financially for transit operators. Between fiscal year 19 and fiscal year 20, fare revenues in Southern California fell from $552 million to $407 million. Subsidies per rider rose 27%, and the cost of an hour of service rose 8%, and largely due to both natural increases as well as the extra efforts that had to go to cleaning vehicles early on. Transit systems, many of them were preparing for the worst. LA Metro's finance folks were looking at a worst case scenario of 40% losses in local option sales taxes, because remember, we were looking at a sort of a public health induced recession, if not depression, at the beginning of the pandemic. And the stimulus really rose to the rescue. The CARES Act in 2020, I've lost my, there we go. $25 billion for transit nationally. The CRRSA in December 2020, another $14 billion, and ARPA just under $31 billion for transit. Enormous bailouts for the industry, and there were unique things about that that really shifted what the feds did. There was no local match requirement. Both operating and capital uses were eligible, and those of you in the industry know that the federal government strongly has strong incentives to use the money for capital than for operating, and there were very few restrictions on eligible uses. We surveyed folks nationally and asked them how there were changes in subsidies coming into their system or revenue sources The blue line is federal subsidies. So over about 2/3 of the people responded that they were getting much more in federal subsidies than they had prior to the pandemic. About 20% said somewhat more, and about 12% said about the same. So no one said somewhat less or much less, and a couple of people weren't sure. The gold shows state, regional, and local revenue sources. There we see a very different picture, right? So that about half of the respondents, or nearly half, said that their revenues were about the same. The next highest was about 28% reporting somewhat less from those. Again, this was in 2021-22, the last winter. A few said somewhat more. It was kind of all over the map, but certainly not the extreme differences with the federal government. So what we saw was this was the federal government's ability to do deficit spending to shift money to the industry, where state funds we were looking at, and many were fearing enormous declines in these, but actually they didn't change that much. There was certainly bumps, but not a significant drop. In Southern California, again, because we have data available on this, the stimulus bills collectively provided transit with about $4.4 billion. Across the three bills, to give an idea of scale, transit operators got about 1.3 times more than an ordinary year's worth of operating funds. So that was on top of what they'd usually get. That was on top of fares, state support, sales taxes, federal capital dollars, and other revenues. The stimulus funding plugged short-term losses in tax revenues in 2020 and more persistent shortfalls in fare revenues that have come forth to the present day. Without the stimulus funds, the agencies that we spoke with said they would have had to make drastic cuts to the detriment of their services, their employees, and ultimately their riders, and that the funding helped them avoid a financial death spiral of cutting service, losing riders, cutting more service, losing more riders. And so in many ways, this is a case study of a successful public policy intervention. I think that the alternate case is pretty easy to see, that there was very short disruptions in funding and longer disruptions in fare revenues, and that these have been bridged quite well to about the present day with this policy intervention. This just gives you a picture of the scale and breadth and depth of the support. So this is Southern California, the SCAG region. You can see that there was a total of 59 operators in Los Angeles County that received some sort of federal funds in the three acts to the tune of about $3.2 billion. 3 in Orange County, 6 in Riverside, San Bernardino, 8 in Ventura, and then 19 multi-county operators, special paratransit, things like that. And it just gives you, again, an idea of comparing their 2018 operating costs to the amount of funding that they received. So pretty significant across the board, and actually highest in the more outlying counties. So the devil, of course, is in the details of this funding. There was a lot of questions about how to divide stimulus funds across urban areas. With the CARES Act, the FTA went with what it knew, and that was the Section 5307 capital formula that they used to dole out the funds. For the two later bills, they shifted to a focus on pre-pandemic operating expenses with caps of 75% and 132% respectively. So they shifted where they put the money, and that was to the urbanized areas. And then within those urbanized areas, how do you do it? There was actually discretion and quite a bit of variation across urbanized areas. Do you use the 5307 formula? Do you proportion it to operating expenses, to predicted or actual losses and other revenues? If some agencies lost more riders than others, should they get more as a result? There was certainly a lot of debate among operators with the MPOs and the other recipients of the federal funds over how they should be divided up. And what we can say is that the choices varied across states and regions and how they chose to do this. This gives you a picture of kind of where the funds went relative to the scale of the operation. This is logarithmic scale in both directions. On the y-axis, up and down, is the federal stimulus funds. On the x-axis, back and forth, is the 2018 operating expenses, both of them logarithmic. What we can see is the blue dots are the largest operators. They're federal claimants, and then there are other sort of voluntary federal reporters who are in gold. Those tend to be the smaller systems. And in general, those federal claimants tended to receive larger shares of money than the other smaller operators, although they were all pretty close to the line, as you can see that. So the smallest agencies tended to get a larger share, a smaller share than the very biggest ones. We also looked, there was a lot of concern early on that in California in particular, local option sales taxes are an important part of funding for public transit, and a fear that this was going to collapse early on. And there was good reason for seeing that. If you look, this is the blue line is the receipts from local option sales taxes. We didn't lose our receipts, it's a local option sales tax lost. And you can see that there was a big drop there in the spring of 2020, but the things bounced back fairly quickly. People stopped going out to dinner and stopped flying places, but they started buying exercise bicycles and remodeling their houses, buying a lot of consumer durables, and as a result, sales tax revenues remain relatively robust. In fact, after that initial drop, it's been relatively impervious to changes in the conditions of the pandemic. So this, for example, is a 7-day rolling average of reported coronavirus cases in the region, and you can see that it doesn't seem to map very well at all with the changes in receipts. Now, this is all receipts, not just for public transit, because different counties devote different shares of their sales taxes to transit receipts. This looks again at just the general volatility of the funds in Southern California. The most receipts are in Los Angeles because they have more than one sales tax, and it's also the largest county. You can see orange, which is incongruously in yellow, and Riverside and San Bernardino are in green and navy blue. So what were some of the things that went on? Early on, there were service cuts. Most transit systems cut service. Some cut it quite substantially. Agencies tended to reduce service more in response to falling demand and limited driver availability and anticipated fare revenue losses than actual shortfalls. So they ended up being in better financial positions than thought. Agencies restored service in advance of returning ridership in general. That is that it didn't wait for demand to go up, but have largely put that back. And the recovery of service has been limited more around available labor than available funding. This is at least what our interviewees tell us. So we saw lots of service changes early on. I just want to show you the wide array. People changed headways and service frequencies. They changed peak hour weekday service hours a lot. They changed off-peak service hours. They eliminated some lines and routes. These are with buses typically. Changed weekend service hours. In some cases, made weekend service hours all week, or they moved Saturday and Sunday service to all days. In some cases, changed the service, and I'm not going to talk about it here, but I looked in another paper. We looked at how transit agencies responded, again, looking at Boston, Houston, Los Angeles, and we found that, in fact, they did redeploy and reallocate service to fit the new geography of demand, which is where there was more ridership demand in lower income in non-white neighborhoods and less going in and out of downtown. We found that transit capital projects were relatively unaffected. There were a few weeks or months where things thought they would be going on hold, but there really wasn't that much change. Most operators, or many of them, especially the larger agencies, either continued or have actually expedited their capital projects as a result of the pandemic. We asked about this again in a national survey. We found that that you can look at the blue was what we heard in the early fall, late summer of 2020, and gold is what we heard in December and January of 2021-22. So in delaying some projects, it was much bigger early on than what we heard later. So there was some delays. A few reported canceling projects, but more reported accelerating some projects. Some said that none were underway, and others just said that capital funding was not yet affected one way or the other. That was about half of the operators most recently. So you can see, I think a lot of it was concern early on, but overall the effects on capital planning have been relatively modest across the sample. Workforce effects we heard a lot about in both our survey and interviews. Early on, many vehicle operators fell sick or took off to care for others that affected both service and morale. Most agencies avoided major layoffs, though some implemented furloughs, salary hiring freezes, and early retirement buyouts. And in fact, we heard some buyer's remorse from some of the folks we talked to about this, where they were those that had done everything they could to keep their operators employed were tended to be in better shape in early 2022 because they hadn't cut their workforce and were able to bring people back on. The others who did lay people off or furlough found that it was hard to get those folks back. Some of the current issues moving forward to wrap up. The pandemic has led to deeper and occasionally crisis level labor shortages. The agencies we spoke with report losing vehicle operators and other frontline employees faster than they can attract new hires. The push factors are operators who don't want to get sick, don't want to enforce public health protocols, or find engaging with stress, don't want to engage with stressful customer interactions. The pull factors are hiring bonuses offered by trucking and delivery firms, competitions within the transit agency, sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul, and then rising wages and inflation across all sectors, making it harder to be competitive. The labor shortage has resulted in missed runs and service cuts on many agencies. The workforce issues, much more than budgets today, are holding back service restoration, report our interviewees. And I would just raise the question whether the situation will change as the Fed continues to raise interest rates in an effort to cool the economy and slow inflation. So some of the things that the operators reported responding, they're offering more incentives for new and existing workers to either attract them or keep them. Systems that directly employ their workforce and that contract out each have been largely unable to nimbly raise their wages and fully respond to the current labor market, either because they have contracts that just aren't up or due, or they've just settled those, or they have an agreement with an operator. Some have discussed sort of early changes to try to stay more competitive. Because of this, systems have generally not reported high increases in labor costs, but shortages have reduced the service and slowed the recovery, and many of them report anticipating significant increases in compensation when their contract renewals come up. We saw, and you're going to hear much more about this later, big changes in fare policy, but these proved to be mostly short-lived. We can see, we asked again in the late summer, early fall of 2020 is the dark blue. The gold is December and January of 21 and 22. Fares collected is normal. It was below half, but about 2/3 report that they're back to doing fare collection as they did before. About a little over 5% report they have reduced their fares somewhat. There was no fare enforcement or an honor system early on for some operators. Some explicitly did not collect fares, about 1/3 of those reporting during the pandemic. That's down to a little over 10%. Some reported never collecting fare, other responses to that. So you can see that the fares not collected is still more than it was likely before the pandemic, but it's down quite a bit from what happened early in the pandemic. So almost all agencies that we surveyed and interviewed had restored fare collection. Most of the staff and decision makers reported that they are not planning for nor generally seriously considering permanent universal fareless transit, although some agencies are. While fare free lowers barriers, the most common reason given for returning to fare collection was making up for lost fare revenues, as well as safety concerns among drivers and passengers over homelessness and capacity issues, were the most reasons offered. Some agencies are using this experiment to turn to targeted fare discount programs for younger travelers, for those with low incomes, and LA Metro is pursuing the latter as an example. Looking ahead, the federal government is returning to its role as a primary capital funder. The bipartisan infrastructure bill promises increased capital funding, but does not squarely address the current operational needs. Stimulus funding is still supporting transit across the state as of the spring of 2022. Many of the operators were candid that they had a nest egg that they thought that could play out for quite a while forward. Others said they were running out of funding fairly quickly. It tended to be the high fare box recovery operators prior to the pandemic who were running out of the funds most quickly, and some reported looking at a fiscal cliff. The agencies have to plan for a future in which ridership continues to return sluggishly or incompletely, and most federal operating support has ended. So while the times have been pretty good in 2022, 2023 and beyond, there are some dark clouds on the horizon. So to conclude, I want to just make 3 or 4 closing points and I'll stop. We now have a heightened social service role for public transit, and that's an incredibly important thing. Travelers with lower incomes and less auto access, who are more likely to be people of color and immigrants, both did not leave transit as much and have returned in far greater numbers. The pandemic has heightened the social service equity role of public transit in the U.S. as a core source of mobility for those without. And that's something that transit needs to lean into as it moves forward. This presents a challenge for transit managers to rethink both the role and evolving patterns of demand for their transit service. Our analysis of Boston, Houston, and LA, as I mentioned, suggested that transit operators redeployed bus service to higher demand, lower income neighborhoods over the course of the the pandemic, showing that they are responding to changes. With respect to commuting to CBDs, more affluent travelers with auto access have largely abandoned transit in the pandemic, though at least some are likely to return as job centers gradually repopulate. The future of central business districts are being debated by scholars. It looks like hybrid work is here to stay, but in prime office space, the question will be, are we going to have more firms, each of whom consumes less office space, and we'll have workers who come to the office less frequently, but might share office space, so that at the end, we may reach densities of office activities that we had prior to the pandemic. This takes a while to play out, as these leases on commercial office space are very long-term and are only going to turn over for the next few years. The question is if you've got someone coming in 2 or 3 times a week, are they going to be more likely to drive, or are they going to more likely to return to riding transit? The vacancies that we're going to see in office space are most likely in sort of a third-class office space, mostly outside of major job centers, and I think that's less of a problem for public transit use, but it's going to take a while for that to shake out. So we have an uncertain fiscal future. We have to plan for ridership return sluggishly. We have a character of transit ridership that may also change, which may depress fare revenues for the longer term. And transit agencies are going to need to adapt their service and financial strategies in response. The goodish news is that the 3 enormous federal pandemic relief bills helped. I have the region here. I meant the state weather the fiscal storm, and instead state and local revenues bounce back more quickly than predicted. With respect to finance, the positive takeaway from this dark time is that a federal major public policy intervention worked, and worked well. But a fiscal cliff looms, particularly for formerly high fare box recovery operators with high proportions of commuters. And whether to what extent states, regions, counties, and cities step in to fill the gap remains a very open and pressing question as we move forward. Thank you very much. I just want to acknowledge my many student and ITS staff colleagues who help contribute to different parts of this research, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Taylor. Really appreciate that fascinating presentation. Lots of lots of questions came from that. Just like to go ahead and start with some of the questions that came to mind. And the biggest one that came to mind was the fiscal cliff issue. So you mentioned that a lot of formerly high earner fare box recovery agencies have fared the worst under this new situation, probably because many of these catered very heavily to central business districts that had a lot of high income individuals who are now working from home. What kind of solutions do you see for those agencies that are facing this fiscal cliff?
Well, as I mentioned, I'm getting a lot of feedback here. So let me see. I'm going to turn it down here a little bit. I think that the situation does have a potentially silver lining in that we see a lot of firms that when they're renewing their leases, they are renewing with taking far less space than they did before. The owners of these buildings are not going to hold the rest of that space vacant. They're going to lease it out. So I think it's possible that in the first class office space, downtown Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego, Sacramento, that we're going to see those places reoccupy over time with densities of activity that might come close to pre-pandemic levels. I think that's going to take a few years to shake out, however. And so that means a difficult time of sort of sitting tight. But there's a lot of evidence that prime office space, and if you're now in, say, second class office space, and you can now rent at a lower rate downtown in prime office space, you may relocate there. So that over time you may fill up with tenants. And again, one of the things is going to be is if you are an owner of that office space, and government has a separate issue with this, but you own this office space, you've got workers in there, you're more likely to have people sharing offices now, doing things to make better use of that smaller space that you're renting. And if that occurs, you now have the same number, you have more people than you had before, and you have more tenants than you had before, and each person is coming less than they did before. But the total number of trips in and out of downtown may start to equal what you saw in the past. If that's the case, the main issue is going to depend a lot on what the parking policies are. The biggest concern I have is not so much whether downtowns will repopulate, but whether someone says, you know, it is $40 a day to park, but I only do it twice a week now. So maybe I'll do that rather than take transit. But if the cost of parking is very high and you have more people occupying that space, I see a future where the demand for peak hour trips in and out of central business districts may return to levels that we had before. I think a lot of it's going to depend on parking and parking policy. And if I were a BART or a Metrolink, I would be very interested in looking at how parking pricing is going in downtown areas, because if a lot of parking is built and it's cheap, that won't bode well for the system. So I think a lot of it's going to depend on not so much the office market, but what the nature of parking is moving forward and the way we manage parking in downtowns.
That's a very interesting point you say about the parking policies, how big of an impact they'll have. I know here in Sacramento, our parking pays for a stadium that was built, and so many people here anticipate that will continue for the time being, so we can pay for that stadium. Now, you mentioned in your presentation that the pandemic showed how much of a social services role that transit played, and it continues to play in our transportation environment. How would you recommend that our traditional approaches to funding transit be adjusted to reflect this social services role?
That's an interesting question. How should the funding be changed?
We have a big discussion today about zero fare transit and experiences with that. Just wondering.
Well, one of the challenges with zero fare transit is that there's no question that when fares go down or they go to zero, you stimulate more ridership, and that lower income riders tend to be more responsive to those changes than higher income riders. However, there's a pretty large body of research that suggests that riders, including low income riders, are more service elastic than they are fare elastic. What that means is that improvements in service will stimulate more ridership than will drops in price. Now, the question is, if you are LA Metro and you're collecting $300 million a year in fares, you get, say, some new source of funding that amounts to $300 million a year. On equity grounds, would you choose to eliminate fares? Or would it make sense to add $300 million worth of service improvements to enable people to spend less time waiting and get to their destination more quickly? That's an empirical question. I think there are really good arguments in certain situations that fare-free transit is a really effective way to go to, especially with very low fare box recovery systems. For higher fare box recovery systems, you tend to have more riders of means, in which case giving them a free ride may be harder to justify socially. That's a tough question, but I think in terms of funding, there is this trade-off always between what could we do with the fare revenue. When you get below 10%, you're spending so much to collect the fare revenue, it starts to raise the question of whether it's even worth it. You then avoid issues of conflicts with operators over fare payment, things like that. There's a lot of arguments for it. Others suggest that you don't necessarily avoid other kinds of conflicts by allowing anyone on the vehicle. I think it's a really interesting policy question with respect to fare-free transit. As far as funding the service, I think that like if the state or regions are looking at increasing funding for transit, I do think it makes sense to probably move funds where riders are, so that if you're an operator that serves a relatively low income population that rides more than other areas, that you would be rewarded for that service. That would be equitable. But in the abstract, I think it's more within the operators of how they allocate the service and the question of how you fund it at this point.
Interesting. Switching over to a different topic, I know this we're ending our time here soon, but I wanted to mention one question that we have. We have something from yes, we got a question from Art Gazzetti. To what degree is it difficult to project the future on the basis of travel trends skewed by pandemic behaviors?
Hi, Art. There was a burst of activity, and I even fell into that in my presentation, of showing you we're all sort of transfixed by 2020. I think that for travel projections, we should put 2020 in the rearview mirror and really focus on 2021 and 2022. That we're seeing certain travel patterns emerge pretty consistently and stably after that tumultuous year of 2020. So, for example, some colleagues at UCLA and I have been looking at just changes in travel overall in the LA metropolitan area. And what we found is that the timing of travel has shifted, where the PM peak period has become much earlier in the day. So that rush hour is starting at 12:30, 1 o'clock, and traveling over a much longer period of time. That has to do with many more people working from home who tend to run errands in the afternoon. So there's a lot of vehicle travel from errand running, and there's also a lot of chauffeuring of kids to and from school. So that those patterns, both of which raise sort of complicated questions for public transit, are very different than the rush hour we saw before the pandemic, which was more likely around 5 or 6 p.m. In Southern California, the peak of the peak right now is 3 to 4 p.m. So, and that's been pretty stable over time. So my suggestion is that operators try to put away the trauma of 2020 and really look at these emerging patterns and where the slopes are. We're seeing a recovery of transit ridership. It's up and down, but the long-term slope is up. And I think that kind of trends we can look for to continue. So my suggestion is to focus more over what's happened in the last year and not on what's happened in the last 3 years in terms of looking forward.
Fascinating. Yeah, no, that's a really good point about putting 2020 behind us. It was a terrible year for almost everybody involved, but the trends that they saw, they set the stage for the future. But we're making a good recovery and focusing on current trends in 2022 and how we react to those. That's a very insightful that I hadn't really thought about. We are out of time for today. Thank you so much, Dr. Taylor. Very, very interesting discussion. I learned so much from your presentation. Thank you so much.
Sure, it's my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
And so again, we are very thankful for Dr. Taylor for his being here today. We're going to go on a break. Okay, it is 10:15. So welcome everybody back from the break. We are pleased to hear from Jillian Gillette, who is from the California Integrated Mobility Program. She's been working here at Caltrans since 2019. She has been the chair of the Caltrain Joint Powers Board of Directors, a transportation coordinator at the San Francisco Department of Public Works, Bureau of Street Use and Mapping, director of transportation policy, Office of the Mayor of San Francisco, and the co-founder of Graphio Incorporated, a custom software development company. Ms. Gillette has also served as the chair of the Transportation Policy Board. So we are very happy to hear from her today, so we can hear about the California Integrated Travel Program. This session will operate similar to the plenary session in that we will have our presentation from Ms. Gillette, and then we will have opportunities to receive questions from the audience. Please send those to me at chad.writing@dot.ca.gov. So we are very excited to hear from you. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Jillian.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Chad, for this opportunity, and welcome everyone. And thanks for the opportunity to give me the opportunity to speak, and just making sure that you all can see my screen. Yes. Okay, so CalITP is the California Integrated Travel Project, is a project of the program that I manage. So my mandate as a program manager at Caltrans is to remove barriers between modes and within modes, starting with transit trip planning and payments. So the Integrated Travel Project is really the transit piece. So here's sort of a brief agenda about what we're going to talk about and when we're going to talk about it. There are 3 agenda points. So CalITP is sort of the innovation. I don't really want to say innovation, but it's sort of the modernization, practical applied research arm of Caltrans. We have 3 main objectives that were arrived to after a series of market soundings and a feasibility study, determining sort of where the state could weigh in to add value for everybody. So our 3 legs of our project are, first of all, making sure that everyone can know what the product that is transit is, what is it, and how much does it cost. What's the product? How much does it cost? Is accurate trip planning information in real time. Number 2 is enabling contactless payments, which we'll get into later, which is about making sure that you can pay for transit the same way that you pay for your coffee. And the 3rd is automating discounts, because right now it's very difficult for some riders to obtain their price. And automating that and making it abiding by privacy rules is a place where the state can be very helpful. So because of the diversity of the transit landscape in California, we have, if you all in, we have 797 agencies or services. Many of them are nonprofits providing paratransit, but there are about 224 fixed route agency services. So we're the largest, most diverse network in the United States. And so, you have a massive difference between large agencies and small agencies. And so we need things to be interoperable, though, if we're going to complete the network. And so the way we operate is looking for standards and requiring that everything be interoperable so that agencies and services can assemble the pieces that they need without being required to purchase or use the pieces that they don't. So that is sort of a integration. Interoperability is our version of integration. But you can see we're not the first to think of this. Here's some statistics from other places that have gone down this path, introducing the kinds of things that we're investigating as well. So real-time data, contactless payments, and helping provide alternatives to cash. You can see dramatic improvements in services worldwide, and there's no reason to think that California is any different. So the business end of the way that CalITP works is that we've put up a marketplace, sort of a Sears catalog, if you will, of transit products that are standardized, that are available to all transit agencies in the country, because states have the ability to do that. So we've competed, put out competitive bids for a series of products and opened them up to any transit agency in the United States, and they're up on this website. And the idea is that this is a simple place for agencies around the country to find standards-based hardware and software and other lightweight products. So it's camobilitymarketplace.org. Okay, so let's take on the first piece of what we're doing. In terms of mobility data, we want to make sure that transit operators and passengers have the best, most accurate information about the product and how much it costs, so that passengers can find out where they want to go and agencies can plan their services better. So to make that real, we've issued our transit data guidelines, which are our implementation and interpretation of the GTFS standard. So to make it clear to agencies how we're moving, we write down what we think, which are our expectations. We assess against those, and then we provide technical assistance. So there's the URL to our guidelines. We have a draft candidate, version 3, I believe, that's out for public comment right now, and we will be adopting that shortly. So on the operator side, on the vendor side, that is the vendors who like to sell things or do sell things to transit agencies, we've worked on a set of mobility data interoperability principles to drive interoperability in an industry that currently doesn't have a lot of interoperable pieces. And so there are a lot of signatories, and the point here is to just break down the silos between the vendors, and support innovation and the entrance of new players into the marketplace. And that's the URL for that on the vendor side. So going back to how we work, we published our expectations of how we interpret the implementation of GTFS. So we assess every transit agency every day against the GTFS standard, and then we issue monthly reports, which is you can find at reports.calitp.org, of each transit agency's GTFS journey. So we download the GTFS static, which is to say scheduled data, every night. And if an agency is operating in real time, we download their data every 6 seconds. And then on the technical assistance side, for agencies that are still struggling to meet the standard, we provide data creation services for some of the new extensions, such as fares and flex. On the open payment side, which is the second leg of our stool, here's our vision that that customers should be able to pay for transit the same way they pay for everything else, including coffee, their dentist's office. And the majority of Americans have a debit or credit card, but they can't use it on transit. So that's our vision here. There are lots of advantages of contactless fare collection that have been demonstrated around the world, and there's no reason to think that they shouldn't work in California. Here's some statistics. For transit operation geeks, the transaction speeds of contactless fare payment are as fast or faster than they are with proprietary cards. And the vast majority of the time that a bus is stopped, it is because they are waiting for customers to pay. So that's a real operational benefit, which results in lower cost and obviously happier riders. Okay, so here's where it starts to get complicated in the payment sector, because payments people, banking people haven't really experienced transit, and a lot of transit folks don't really understand how the payments and banking system works. So I always present these slides. So this is how the global banking system works. The payment networks, such as MasterCard, Visa, Discover, and Amex, run the networks, which are the lines. They have established these global networks, and the on-ramps onto the network are what are called issuers, and they're typically banks. So what you have is what's called the four-square model, which is the customer and their bank, the bank that issued them a debit or credit card that runs on the MasterCard or Visa network, say, and then you have the merchant, which in our case is the transit operator, and their bank, hopefully. And again, Visa and MasterCard run that whole network. So today, we're not really on this network yet because we lack these three pieces. And that's exactly what CalITP has, with the Department of General Services, procured for and put up on the mobility marketplace. So to go open loop, to be able to accept standard debit and credit cards, you need three products. One is you need the back-end payment processor, which is the provider's bank, typically, that understands how to run a transit transaction and is just all they're responsible for is moving the money from the customer's bank to the merchant's bank. Between them and the hardware, which is we call a validator, but is really just a point-of-sale terminal, just like you see at any retail location. That's the sort of bottom piece there. Between them and the bank that moves the money is what's called a transit processor, because we needed to have a fancy title, but really that's just the software that runs on the point-of-sale terminal. It has to be a little bit specialized for transit because it needs to be able to do maths, because some transit agencies run on distance-based or zone-based schedules, and so the validator needs to be able to calculate that, and that processor also holds the agency's business rules. Okay, so because neither transit didn't understand payments and banking, and conversely, banking and payments didn't understand transit until recently, what are known as merchant services don't exist for the transit industry. And we've spent a lot of time and money trying to sort of franken build them ourselves. So if you're a business on the bank rails, such as a coffee shop or the dentist's office even, or Walmart, you get your own information back, often joined with additional information that helps you run your business. So the payment networks and the banks are beholden to regulated privacy and security rules. So they can't share individual transaction data about the customer with you, but they can share information on a planning level, which is great for us. And they can, again, join it with other information, such as, your typical customer is interested in X, Y, or Z. So because those don't exist, CalITP is helping transit agencies get what they need, and helping them find what they could have by working with the payments industry to produce merchant services for transit. And if you join up as a CalITP agency, you'll get a dashboard that helps deliver that until it becomes standardized. So I often am asked or told that this is an elite system, that it doesn't work for underbanked riders, but that's the whole, to the contrary, that's the whole point of the state of California entering into this discussion. That is how we can provide value. So the state of California, like most states, is heavily involved in payments. There are lots of benefits programs that we deliver. There are lots of transactions that we deliver. And so it's very much in our interest to make sure that the network is complete. That is to say that it's very much in our interest to make sure that everyone has access to a low-cost, private, secure, reliable, general-purpose payment method. And they exist today already. In the case of, for instance, the Cash App, which is a Visa and Square product, Venmo and PayPal issue accounts. And these are all accounts that are very popular with under and unbanked populations because they don't require a minimum balance. They're not a full-blown bank account, but they do offer a lot of financial services, including the ability to upload your cash. And they, again, are regulated according to the bank rules. And in the case of the Cash App, you do not need to have a social security number to get a debit account on the Cash App. You can present any state ID or driver's license as your credential, which is a very progressive move. So that is very much in our interest to make sure that Californians have that. And that's hard to do if you're a transit agency trying to do this by yourself. All right, so here's some, we like to operate almost like a software company and demonstrate, not pilot, but demonstrate that things work so that people could touch and feel the product without having to, try to visualize what it is. So we work with the Coalition of the Willing, so agencies that are interested in moving in this direction. To build proof of concepts in California and work out as many of the kinks as we can to scale it appropriately for transit. So we were, the SAC-RT was the first rail customer for open loop in the United States. So they went open loop on their light rail facilities last year. And they're planning to expand it to the rest of their fleet, and that is California Transportation Secretary Tokes Omashakin tapping his Visa card on the validators of the point-of-sale terminal on a light rail vehicle. Next, we worked with two agencies, adjacent agencies in Santa Barbara MTD and the Santa Barbara Clean Air Express. One is commuter, one is a urban transit provider. To go open loop, and the Commuter Express system was so delighted with the product that they made their own movie about it. The demonstration here was that you can transfer from one agency to another, and the system works and is integrated across agencies because it's the way that we pay for everything else anyway. We went live with the LAX Flyaway bus service last year as well. This is a MasterCard sponsored project on the LAX shuttle service that runs between LAX and various sites in Los Angeles. And this is an app-based service. In other words, the point-of-sale terminal is the customer's cell phone. The newest demonstration that we're working on is a paratransit like paratransit service, but courtesy of FACT, which is our partner down in San Diego County. And that is an interesting demonstration for us because there is not yet a general transit feed specification extension for paratransit. So we're taking it in backwards order and working on payments first, and then working on the trip planning component. And our very first customer, so we saved the best for last, is Monterey Salinas Transit, which really went first. They were the first debit and credit card demo in the state of California, and they have really demonstrated all of our products. And they're a great first partner because Monterey is a tourist location, so there are a lot of international tourists who are already used to paying with their debit or credit card and expect that. And then conversely, Salinas is a community where there are many underbanked and unbanked residents, some of whom work in the hospitality industry serving the tourists in Monterey, and some of whom work in the agricultural sector and typically are unbanked. And so it was in the transit operators agency's interest to help the underbanked customers who would emerge from the hotels with their pay in cash in their pockets not get mugged at the bus stations. So let's see. Oh, there it is. There's a little movie. Hopefully it shows. Looks like maybe I can't get it to work. Can I? No. Anyway, there's a movie that doesn't work in this presentation, but it shows the general manager, Carl Sidorek, tapping his Square Cash embedded debit card in the wallet on his phone, tapping on a point of sale terminal on one of his buses in Monterey Salinas. So going back to the under and unbanked slide, again, this is really where the state can add value and where we're really leaning in to make sure that as many Californians as possible have an account, a general purpose account, because we don't just want a specialized account for transit. We want them to have a general purpose account so that when they get off the bus, they can use that account to pay for food or anything else that they need to pay for. And because the world really is starting to move away from cash, and we need to provide an alternative for customers who rely more heavily on cash today. So let me go back to this very quickly. So one way that we seeded this conversation was with the Cash app in Monterey Salinas. We partnered with them under the condition that they enable a cash top-up feature, meaning that the customers of the Cash app could take their cash to a location and have it put on the account. And there are a lot of services today that provide that sort of middleman, but the average fee in the United States is $5 to make that translation. So that's really a non-starter for the transit industry, where often the fee, the transit trip is $2. So the Cash app tried to get it for free, but it's $1, which is $4 less on average per transaction than it is for other providers. So that was a real inducement. And so here's some statistics. Between May and August of last year, 30% of the new Cash app customers in Monterey Salinas transit service area were directly attributable to this project, meaning the very first time that the customer used their contactless card. Here's mine. My son designed it. That's why it's yellow and has a skull on it. But it's it's Cash app Visa card. The very first time the customer tapped their card was on a Monterey Salinas bus, which is an enormous percentage. And by the end of that same period, 93% of the transactions of those customers were not for transit, but were generally for food, meaning that we used transit as a financial inclusion pathway, which is very, very exciting. Furthermore, the customers that use the Cash top-up feature are twice as likely as regular Square Cash customers not to have associated their Square account with their own bank account. And that's a hallmark of the unbanked. So that's even more exciting that we have brought in unbanked customers because they've understood that this is better than a bank account for them. So we were sort of able also to kind of align incentives, and Square put some of its marketing money up into billboards to help inform customers about how to access the program. So the final most exciting thing that we do is called CalITP Benefits, which is automating customer discounts. So our first customer, again, here is Monterey Salinas, and we're working with seniors. So there is a link, and that's associated with a QR code, where seniors in the Monterey Salinas transit area can associate their transit discount, their senior fare, with their payment card by signing up. And it's a partnership between CalITP, the California Department of Technology, and the General Services Administration. So the front end of the application is signing up for your login.gov account. And then you're delivered your benefit. And once you've signed up, your benefit will extend to any other transit agency in California that sort of joins CalITP. And next steps for us will be to move from seniors to other discount types like veterans, people with disability, hopefully students, and low income, of course. So finally, The way we operate to make this possible and easily accessible for transit agencies, because a lot of transit agencies are too small to actually procure, they wind up only being able to purchase, and typically only once every 12 years or so when they get a new bus. So we've accounted for their business model and pre-procured the 3 pieces as of today that transit operators anywhere in the country need to go open loop. So the payment processor that moves the money from the customer's bank account to the merchant's bank account is available on our website, themobilitymarketplace.org. The fare calculation software, which is basically the point of sale terminal software, and the point of sale terminal itself. All 3 of them are available via master service agreements, which is what California is the California name for state purchasing schedules. And again, they're open to any transit agency in the United States without further competition. So again, they're here, the 3 contracts that you need. They're in different categories. It's a little bit complicated. And here are the vendors that you can choose from in each category on our website. But because it's technical, there's some pieces that you have to fill out. So by any means, if you are an agency and are interested in this, feel free to reach out to us at hello@calitp.org, and we'll give you technical assistance to help you onboard onto this or onto your to make sure that your GTFS is up to snuff. But in terms of what you will be doing, you can estimate right up front what this is going to cost you as a maximum, because when we negotiate out of the state of California, all of the prices are public. All 3 of the vendors are willing to offer contracts for less, which you could negotiate, and we'll help you negotiate that or provide you advice. But in any case, you can estimate the cost right up front on our website. And then finally, these are the 3 state partners. This is the kind of value that we believe that the state can provide to agencies so that agencies can focus on their core business, which is delivering more service. So again, if you need help, because this is a complicated subject, we're trying to bring together some very complicated public policy problems, feel free to email us at hello@calitp.org, and we will be glad to help. So that's my presentation, really hoping for lots of questions and comments. Take it away, Chad.
Yes, sorry, let me go ahead and get my light set up here. Okay. Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. Lots of progress you've made through the CalITP program. Wanted to kind of focus this on my first question for you is, so the CalITP obviously has been focusing primarily on California agencies. Have you gotten a lot of interest from other states or internationally on this program? And if so, could you explain that to us?
Sure, thanks. That's a great question. So yes, South Carolina's Coast RTA is the first of many out of California transit agencies. They're first in that they just zipped through our contracts in under 2 months. They went from 2 months within meeting us to going live, having point of sale terminals on their buses. So they went live, I think 3 weeks ago. It might be, yeah, I think it's 3 weeks ago. So they went live on a Monday. By Wednesday of that same week, 10% of their customers were already paying that way. So that's 10% in 3 business days. And then by the week after that, they were already at 15%, and I haven't checked in on them again. So more agencies from South Carolina are coming. There are agencies in several other states that are working their way through selecting a vendor using the California MSAs. And yes, we've gotten lots of interest in this from DOTs around the country and from local agencies who really understand the buying power of the state of California, because we are now the 4th largest economy in the world, I heard yesterday. So then in terms of international interest, yeah, so international interest is twofold. One is all of the banking regulations are really different overseas than ours, mostly because of the number of banks that we have. So overseas, they're very interested in CalITP benefits. We are the first in the world, really, to sort out associating your discount with your open payment credential. So they're very interested in that, because even Transport for London, for instance, which went open loop first, still issues Oyster cards to seniors, and has a very complicated sign-up process that they would like to make simpler, I believe. So there's interest there on the payment side for sure, in terms of benefits. More of the interest internationally has been on the GTFS front, where the general transit feed specification really has become the standard that more sort of end users use anywhere else on the globe, right? So everybody kind of uses Google or Apple Maps, so you want at a minimum to be available there. And there aren't really great standalone products that help the full range of agencies meet that. So we're working very much on making sure that there's a solution for American transit agencies there, and I believe that those kinds of products will also sell well in Europe.
Interesting about how the benefits are spreading, and how we're kind of starting to move away from the proprietary closed loop payments. And how
Yeah,
the
I mean, a
open loop payments
hallmark,
is the future.
this is sort of a natural role for the United States. I mean, my favorite anecdote here is that you can look on any baseboard in any building in the United States and recognize what a three-pronged outlet is. It took us a little bit of arguing in the 80s, I remember, about that third prong. But it's a hallmark of the United States that we've managed to get fierce competitors to agree not to compete about something fundamental and standardize on that. And you can see in other countries where there are different receptacles on the bottom, on the baseboards, because people have changed their minds over time. And that, that lack of consensus on a platform that you can build on that's based on a standard really causes problems. And you can see those problems in transit today.
Absolutely, yeah. A lot of cell phones used to have their own proprietary charging technology. Now it's pretty much standard to use the USB format.
Exactly. Because I think competitors realize it's better for the customer.
Kind of the flip side, or the opposite question of this would be, has there been any reluctance from transit agencies on adopting the system? And if so, how have you been able to overcome that?
Yeah, so I think first of all, let me break it down into two halves, right? There's the big agencies who have disposable income, not really, but they have a lot more capacity than the small agencies. So bigger agencies in California have an IT department. They have a procurement department. They have transportation planning, the planning department. Small agencies have none of those, right? Sometimes we joke that like my grandmother drives the bus, and that's not too far off of the truth. So small agencies don't have procurement departments. They often don't have a procurement staff at all. They don't have the ability to procure, either to run the technical components, much less to build the requirements of a very complicated product. So, and that's true, generally, for PPE as well. And so imagine what it's like for technology, right? So the small agencies are very, very cautious about spending precious operating or capital dollars on something that is risky, because they can't afford risk. So we have de-risked this for them by using standards which are regulated for privacy and security, and we provide the technical assistance to help them on board. So that's the technical assistance. And the fact that we have procured using the state of California's procurement arm gives them a lot of comfort. And they're basically, in my experience, delighted to be included as a merchant and to be included in the product universe in a way that they really haven't been before. They've just had to accept things that came with the bus. The larger agencies are, I think, are leaning towards open loop because they see that it's sort of the future, right? That everybody, even dry cleaners and coffee shops, started to accept debit and credit cards once Square came along, and that it's coming. I think the resistance there is, if you've invested in a lot of proprietary systems, you need to figure out how to transition, and how to transition that honors what you've done and doesn't that doesn't cost you undue amounts of money is really the the conundrum there. And so I think it'll happen. It's just going to take time.
Yeah, interesting how you note how the technical assistance and the transition from proprietary systems is so difficult. I think a lot of people in other aspects of our life, we see how, you're stuck in a proprietary system. It's somewhat hard to exit that system.
Well, that's right. And I think if you are so strapped for resources to procure, you're really leaning on your vendors almost to tell you what to procure a little bit, right? Which is unfortunate because it doesn't really allow you to get a second opinion because you can't afford to get a second opinion, right? So that's really a space that we need to open up for all kinds of operators to know that there are alternatives that are market tested that have worked everywhere else in the world.
So you've definitely accomplished a lot in the past few years that you've been with the Cal ITP program. I think it's about 3 years now.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you see the Cal ITP going in the next several months?
Oh, thank you. Wow. So if wishes were horses, we could all take a ride, right? But my goal is, so moving from out of the Cal ITP project into the California Integrated Mobility Program, my goal is to make sure that a customer can take any trip that they want to take, right? That's how people think. I need to get from here to there. And if that trip, we want that trip to include multiple modes, preferably a sustainable mode like transit or biking or scootering and walking, of course, right? It's really hard to transition between all of those products today because transit is cash heavy, and then you have all of these apps that must be downloaded. So, if you're like me, you have thousands of apps on your phone, and that alone, you have like API sprawl is the new term for that. It just makes it really confusing. So making sure that the customer can seamlessly pay using what's already in their pocket, which is their debit or credit card, for every transportation service that they need, because that's how they pay for everything else. And making sure that that's possible across modes, I think, and making sure that everybody, again, in California at least, who is underbanked, has a safe and reliable and low fee, if not no fee, alternative to pay.
Wow, that is I think it's a great vision because one of the things that we have is just, as you said, the complexity of moving between different platforms, having to download apps. I know it seems like every time you go somewhere new, you have to download a new app. But having a simple, unified system, I think, would benefit a lot of people by making everything more convenient.
I agree. I mean, we got to have that as a minimum. Premium services, if you want additional trip planning components or you want additional, components, that makes all the sense in the world. But don't exclude people who, otherwise can pay from. Make it easy for everybody to pay.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yes. The more we can have interoperability of systems and integrated systems and being able to use those open loop payments, I think the easier it will be for everybody to travel. Wanted to see, you touched upon it here in this question, but looking out 1, 5, and 10 years, what does success look like for the California Integrated Travel Program and the California Integrated Mobility Program?
Okay, so within 1 year, I would like to see every fixed route transit agency in California on compliant with the real-time general transit feed specification. Everyone in California should know where the bus is and where the train is in real time. That would be a year 1 goal, and we're going to make sure that that's possible by making sure that those products exist for every agency in California. I would also like, I'm hesitant to put a percentage on the number of transit agencies that go open loop because there are just so many things outside of our, ability to provide technical assistance. There are a lot of nuances there. But I would hope that at a minimum in a year, by the end of the year, every fixed route transit agency, at least in California, understands what open loop is and has started to go down the path of becoming a merchant, at least initiated the conversations. Within 5 years, I would like to see a statewide bike sharing procurement, because we know that there are many places in California where bike share works technically and by demographics. But again, building that kind of program and procuring for it is really hard. And so the state could do that, and then municipalities could just download those. And I would say a condition of that sort of contract should be that those providers accept straightforward open loop payments, so that transit customer can get off a bus and take bike share if they want. That would be great within 5 years. Also within 5 years, I would like to see lots more signage and wayfinding that is GTFS based, so that Californians are used to seeing GTFS information, real-time passenger information presented to them sort of in the same way across signage, annunciators, on their phones, kind of like the three-prong outlet. So that we, eat our peas and carrots first before we go for fancy things like dessert and, wacky innovative apps. Like, let's do the basic things. Within 10 years, I would like to see all of the benefits programs in California, from food stamps to electric vehicle charging benefits and transit benefits, that Californians can pull those down all into the same account if they want those benefits on their account, and that everyone in California has at a minimum a basic payments account. And that bus agencies, transit agencies on the vehicle side have continuous access to standards-based bus technologies, regardless of which bus they buy, right? That they're different business decisions, and that those components should be kept up to date, even if you can't purchase a bus less frequently than every 12 years.
Yeah, that's very interesting how you put about the bus platforms, because that's something that we're so keen on, is that, the cost of each bus is very high. Many of them are almost custom procurements for each
Exactly.
bus. And so the more they can do to streamline that and make sure that it's more accessible for all agencies would be a big win for the state.
Agreed. And for the operator, I think that today, a lot of the technologies, you're shackled to, at least 5 years of contract. And that's just not how the world works anymore. We need to make sure that basic products are commoditized, right? We want some choice in staplers, but not that much. Right? Basic things should be commodities. And you see that happening on the retail side already, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Sometimes you're faced as a consumer with the torture of choice. I think some people have used it to say. Finally, the last couple minutes we have with you, I just wanted to know, what is the biggest obstacle that Cal ITP has faced, and how have you overcome it?
I think the biggest obstacle that we've faced is state agencies recognizing the fiduciary responsibility of Caltrans towards the vast number of transit agencies in California, even though that's not the largest ridership, right? Really realizing that many local agencies can't do it themselves. And so just asking them in their opinion in a planning process is only part of the solution. We really need to go all the way out to market to make sure that they have access. And if there are gaps in the market, identifying those and filling those, I think, has been a really big struggle. And I think that, bless the Department of General Services, they've really taken the governor's executive order for innovative procurements to heart. And I think that's what we've shown with the mobility marketplace, and we should do a lot more of that. It's really hard to ask the buying arm of California, which has all sorts of things to purchase, to make a buy only for local agencies, right? No state agency is going to buy off of these things because we don't run transit, is a big ask, but it's critical to understanding that there are structural barriers for transit. Transit cannot succeed without certain structural barriers. And as long as every bus in the United States comes with a cash fare box strapped to it like an Iron Maiden with no other solution, right? Transit just can't succeed. That's not the way the world is going anymore.
Absolutely, yeah. I know when I first met you about 3 years ago, you were describing some of the obstacles you were facing, and I think a lot of this was the payments issue and how to deal with that. You know, setting up a system with California state government to make those master service agreements so easy for the transit agencies. And I've seen the success that you've had, and far beyond what I think you had said at the time and what we all kind of had hoped for, is to get the system set up that is now going national and ideas going international. Thank you so much for your time, Jillian. Really appreciate your presentation. We have your contact up on the screen, so if anybody has any questions, hello@calitp.org. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact them. Again, thank you so much, Jillian. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Talk to you soon. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.
So we are going to move on to a 15-minute break. There we go. Hello and welcome back from the break. We're going to have a very interesting symposium session about zero fare transit. And we have two program managers who have a lot of experience in this area. As you know, zero fare transit is a big topic in the transit community, and we're interested in hearing how it's worked in practice. So joining us for this session, we have Adam Barth, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Stanislaus Regional Transit Authority based in Modesto, California. That's about an hour and 20 minutes from where I am in Sacramento. Adam was the Director of Operations and Planning at STAN RTA, so Stanislaus Regional Transit Authority. He was the transit manager at City of Modesto, operating the Modesto Area Express, or MAX, service prior to the STAN RTA formation in 2021. Before working in Stanislaus County, Adam was a transit manager in Fairbanks, Alaska, where he learned the workings of public transit at a small transit agency. He started his transportation career working in the private industry by operating tour buses for the cruise lines in Alaska. Adam graduated from the Leadership APTA program organized by the American Public Transit Association. In addition, he was recognized with the Rising Star Award by the California Association for Coordinated Transportation, or CalAct. Adam received a master's degree in transportation management from San Jose State University's Mineta Transportation Institute, also a co-sponsor of this event, in June 2022, so congratulations. And he holds a bachelor's degree from Brigham Young University. So after hearing from Adam, we will hear from Ross McDonald. I'll give an intro to him as he comes to speak. But Adam, please feel free to start sharing your screen, and please start at any time.
So this a little bit of introduction to the STAN RTA, or the S is what we're called. So the S is a joint powers agency that was recently created about a year and a half ago, or maybe even 2 years ago now. Created by the city of Modesto and Stanislaus County, creating a regional transit agency for our area to create more efficiencies in the service, just to make it easier for folks to get around. Before, there were two different systems that were branded different and had different fares and such. So we've only been in existence now for a couple of years. The system itself has 83 fixed route buses, 7 commuter buses, and 40 paratransit vehicles, with an operating budget of $37 million a year. We have 25 fixed routes in the Modesto, where the majority of the routes are in Modesto, and then some rural routes throughout the county, and then 3 commuter routes that go to the Bay Area, over to the BART station in Pleasanton, and then of course, the ADA paratransit service. And we have a handful of demand response services as well that's open to the general public. In all, about 2.5 million rides a year. To give you a little sense of our size and our scope. Here, just a map of where we're at. So the red dot there on the left, in California, that's about where Modesto's at. Then zoomed into on the right is Stanislaus County. So right there in the middle of the state, in the middle of the San Joaquin Valley, about an hour and 20 minutes south of Sacramento, and about the same distance east from San Francisco. This is just a route map of our service area in the Modesto area only. The routes that go into the rural area, that's a bigger map, but I didn't show that here. Just to give you a sense of the different routes that we have in the area. Most routes are about 30 minutes. They run every 30 minutes all day long, with a handful of routes that only run every hour. We do have two routes that run every 15 minutes as well. So have a breadth of different routes there. Give you a sense of what our fares are today when we're not free. These are the fares that we charge, with the base fare being $2, which is a day pass. So you pay the $2 on the bus, you automatically get a day pass. We don't have a one-way trip fare. It is just the one-day pass is the regular fare. So it makes a whole lot easier to ride the bus if you just buy it once and that's it. You're good for the rest of the day. Then we have 7 and 31-day pass options as well. So very simple fare structure and very for a very simple way to ride the bus. As it's simple and easy to use, the more likely folks will use it. So free fares. We started offering free fares a few years ago, only during certain times of the year. We're going to go through that here in just a moment. Free fares were offered on the S, which is our agency, through a Caltrans grant called the Low Carbon Transit Operations Program, or LCTOP is what we call it here. The program provided funding to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, strengthen the economy, and improve public health and the environment. And these free fares accomplishes that by providing incentives for folks to use the bus. So free fares were offered on our system during the following times of the year, and since 2019, we've done this every year with not much deviation. So we've done free fares the whole month of July each year. Rideshare week in October, which is most of the time around the first week of October. Go Green Week in March, which is the week of whenever March 17th falls. Earth Day in April, Bike to Work Week in May, which is usually the first week in May, and then Dump the Pump Day in June. So those are the dates that we provided free fares on our system. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the impacts to providing these free fares, and there's 3 or 4 of them I'm going to talk about. We have had success with them for sure, and I'll talk about those, but we have had some other issues as well. The free fares during the certain time periods have worked well for us to really entice folks to use the bus. Anyway, the first impact to providing free fares is on-time performance. So if when you think of providing free fares, you think that there'd be more folks on the bus, there'll be more folks at bus stops. It's going to take longer for people to get on because there's more people to get on the bus, and it might be more crowded as well. So we looked at on-time performance and how that's impacted our system over the last few years. We're able to track our on-time performance via our CAD ABL system, and I just put a picture of that on the screen that you can see the bus that's there on the screen, and it's on time. And but there are buses that are late. But I pulled the on-time performance for July. That was the best time period to use because the whole month was free. The first year that we did free fares was in 2019, but I wanted to pull the 2018 free fare, or that time period as well, just to have a comparison versus a fare paid month and a free fare month. So 2018 was a paid month, where 2019 and 2020 and 2021 were all free months. So there were some fluctuations there in on-time performance. I realized though that 2020 and 2021 were different types of years. That on-time performance, it's hard to calculate that. But when looking at 2018 to 2019, yeah, there were some minor fluctuations, but I also compared to August there as well, because August was a fair paid month for those services on all the years. So you can see that the changes were about the same, and there wasn't a big fluctuation in on-time performance. So you might think there were. You might think that even with the higher ridership that you would expect with free fares, that on-time performance might improve because people are able to board the bus a lot faster. They're not able you don't need to stay at the fare box to put the cash in the box or to run a pass. You just get on, the driver counts you, and that's it. But we didn't generally see that happening, but it is a concern to be aware of when offering free fares. Okay, next. So unwelcome behavior on the bus, which is kind of an issue that you would expect to have with free fares. So drivers reported that people were on the bus for long periods of time. Basically, they just used the bus as a place to hang out. Drivers called them rolling homeless shelters, as sometimes folks would ride the bus for a long time. On our commuter services over to BART, that's a good 1.5 to 2 hour service to BART and then to get back. And so it's a long time, and sometimes folks would just ride the whole route there and back. As a warm place to be, a nice soft seat to be in, and you can sleep on the way, and it all worked fine for those folks. So those are some of the issues that we had with people being on the bus a long time. Also, we had more folks on the bus with poor hygiene, people with dirty clothes, or just things on their clothes that stained seats. And so we had to deal with those things as well. It was an issue that involves more marketing and more support for drivers and with security to help curb those issues and help keep the system as a place where everyone wants to be there, and make it a pleasant place to be. So some of the mitigation efforts I just talked about. We just need more enforcement of the policy to make sure that the rules are being kept, and that everyone's having a good time, an appropriate time on the bus. So the next thing is ridership on the bus, increased ridership. You would expect to see that on the bus when you have free fares, and we saw that. You can see here at the graph on ridership in July. You can see all the months across the bottom, and they definitely want to just look at the 2018 and 2019 numbers. So that's be the gray line and the yellow line in July. So you see that 2018, the number was a little over 150,000 a month for that month or that year in July. And in 2019, the first year where we had the free fares, you see it jumped up to 250,000 rides, which is a huge increase. It was a 63% increase in ridership. It was kind of it was unexpected for sure, but it was nice to see. And then you can see that over the next months after that ridership continued to be above the 2018 numbers, which is also great to see. We didn't have free fares during those months except for 1 week in October, but we continue to see that trend of more people on the bus. Once you get into the 2020 and 2021 numbers, you see the ridership declines there, as we all saw with transit systems throughout the country. But that ridership continued to increase in 2021, and even today into 2022, we're seeing increases and are just about pre-pandemic levels there. So our numbers in 2022 are about at the yellow line today, which is great. An economic impact was the last thing I wanted to talk about, the free fares for riders and how that affected how that affected riders. So obviously you don't have to pay for the bus. You can use that cash for other life needs. You can a story that I heard from one of the drivers is that people that take the bus to go to the grocery store were able to take more family with them, to have them carry more groceries home with them. So on our system, they're limited to 4 bags per person. And so that, obviously only allows you so much on the bus. And you can have a small car, but not something big on the bus as well. But if you're able to bring more people with you, maybe kids or other folks with you to the store, everybody can carry that much on the bus. And so they're able to take more home with them, which was great. So families before, when they had to pay for kids to ride the bus, they now had the opportunity everyone can come and everyone can bring a bag home, which is great. Recently, just in the last 6 months, we've implemented free fares for youth on all services. That's just something we've done in the last 6 months. But we provide youth free year round on every route everywhere. And so we don't have that issue now where moms and dads can bring their kids on the bus and they can bring bags home and they don't have to pay for them on the bus. But in the past, when these free fares were offered, that was a story that we heard. Anyway, then going down to youth, as they're free now, as I said, year round. But during the free fare programs that enabled them to get around as well, gave them the freedom to go to their friends' homes or go to the mall or wherever they wanted to go, and not having to rely on mom or dad to take them places. And so those things have helped really improve the system and get people on the bus, get youth on the bus. It helps them learn how to use the bus, and they use that skill as they continue on in life as well. Anyway, that's all I had on the impact of free fares in Stanislaus County. And with that, I'll back to Chad. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. Really appreciate that interesting presentation about what's going on in Modesto. Our next speaker will be Ross McDonald. Before I continue on with Ross's bio, we will have, time permitting, some opportunities for questions at the end of this session. So Ross started his career in state government after 12 years working for international manufacturing companies. In 2004, he joined the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection and worked on land use policies and transit-oriented design. He then moved to Vermont in 2007, working for the Vermont Agency of Transportation. In December 2019, he was named the Public Transit Program Manager, and he's working on a combination of business, environmental, and other types of projects that contribute to this public transit. So Ross was also named the 2018 Rural Transit Champion by the Transportation Research Board. So we could have no better speaker on rural transit and zero fare transit than Ross. So Ross, please feel free to share your screen at any time. And we very much appreciate your coming to speak to us today.
Sure. Well, thank you, Chad. And it's my pleasure. We'll see if I'm the right person for the job here as we get along. But I appreciate everybody's interest in this topic. It's something that in Vermont we have wrestled with since I've been around for 15 years. Today, we'll just briefly touch upon the basics. What is the history and current status of our fare policy? We have a legislative study that we are been charged with that is due soon. I'm part of a NCHRP study for a larger scope and maybe more useful to more DOTs around the state, around the country. Talk about the transit funding study because whether it's fare free or fares, it's all just contributing to the way that we're paying for transit services. And then talk about next steps as well. To start with, I would just like to mention Vermont is, I think I can just bring this up here. Vermont has the highest percentage of people who live in a rural area than anywhere else in the country. And so we only have one area that is a 5307 urban provider, and that's a GMT right here. The rest are all 5311 services. We do about 5 million trips a year. Our budget's around $44 million with state and federal funds. And in Vermont, we receive 12, $14 million in state formula dollars. And then we go ahead and we pull in about $20 million from the FHWA program. So we grab some monies from the bridge and highway section, bring it over to further our transit goals. And then we contribute up to $9 million of T-fund monies or state funds. And our providers, the 7 providers around the state, will provide up to another 4 million or so. So 650,000 people, about $60 on average per person investment in public transit. So it's a small state with big plans, but just wanted to share that with you before we get started. In pre-COVID, we had the majority of our fares coming from our 5307 area, Burlington, Vermont. All routes charged fares anywhere from $1.50 to $4. And then we receive only about $580,000 in fares throughout the rest of the state. 2 of the 7 providers had chosen to be fare free or zero fare for several years, approaching a decade. And even in those areas that fares were charged, there were certain routes that didn't have fares, whether it was resort routes, helping to pay for the routes, local businesses, local communities. We really left it up to the providers in those 7 regions to determine which routes should charge fares, and even if they want to charge fares at all. Post-COVID, COVID hits, the emergency comes down, and all fares were waived in March of 2020. Like so many other areas, no contact. We erected the barriers to protect the driver from the riders from the driver. All of those steps included a zero fare system. We then used our COVID relief funds to cover the operations in the last few state fiscal years and maintain that zero fare status. And then coming into this state fiscal year, starting in July, the legislature had chosen to maintain zero fare service as we rebuilt from the pandemic, and inserted another $1.25 million into our budget, primarily for the 5307 urban area, which was feeling the effects of zero fare far more than our other providers. Well, in the last 3 years, we've been able to get some surveys and some feedback from around the state. And no question, the riding public can appreciate zero fare service. However, when talking about the use of resources and providing that zero fare service, we did hear feedback from a percentage of people saying, well, I would rather have more hours or more days of service and pay a fare than to be fare free 5 days a week in the limited hours that are up and running. We haven't found zero fares or the fares to be a barrier or a major factor in using the transit system. Ridership is all over the place, just as Adam was showing you. It's tough to figure out exactly the effects of zero fare policy on ridership. We're about 80% of pre-COVID levels, right around 40 or 4 million, trying to get back to that 5 million pre-COVID goal that we've set internally. Certainly, it's easier to use the system. No fares for any routes, just makes it knowable for anybody in any region going on any bus. That's a marketing opportunity, and we have seized that opportunity to let folks know it's welcoming and it's time to get back on the bus. And then the public transit providers, you can imagine the drivers really support the policy of zero fares. Certainly on-time performance is a big factor. Also, most of the issues that people had with riders was holdups, fare issues, questions, people trying to buy passes on the bus, things like that. Fleet management, we have 425 vehicles traveling around the state. The fleet managers don't have to worry about fare box equipment being used. So that's been helpful to ensure that the fleet in the best condition is getting out there without fare box considerations. And then certainly there are times an overhead saved by not collecting. Everyone's aware that a percentage of the fare box recovery is taken up by fare box costs and the collection and the overheads to deposit those fares. But when talking with the public transit providers, in my job as the program manager, I'm hearing that this isn't a fait accompli, that this is the best way to proceed. People citing that they charged fares pre-COVID where it was necessary and were able to be fare free where that was an opportunity or made sense in their region. We'll have to consider what we're going to be doing next. And how are we going to consider what to do next? Well, we're going to participate and try to learn more. First things first, this legislature coming up has tasked us through the last session to report on changes in public transit ridership and estimate the amount of funding needed to provide zero fare service in the following state fiscal year. Certainly everybody wants to see the ridership trends by county, how it affects different areas in the state. They want to know what that estimate is needed for zero fare service. And then a little bit deeper dive, how does that affect our ADA service and our NEMT service? In our state, our public transit providers do that fixed route service, but they also do demand response services for ADA, for NEMT, and we have our own Vermont Elders and Persons with Disability program. All told, about 700,000 of those 5 million trips are being done through volunteers and our other dispatch dial-a-ride type services. But we know that we're able to charge ADA programs, where a person twice the fare. NEMT, same thing. Without those revenues, what does that do as a multiplier on the impacts of being a zero fare system? That is due in December, and I'll be bringing that forward along with what we're learning in this larger study. And I'm one of a few folks who are working on this NCHRP study, and it really is to take a picture of zero fare transit in the United States. What is the role for DOTs in developing those policies? Strategies for moving from a shorter term zero fare pilot to longer term zero fare policies. And then looking at route and demographic characteristics that promote long-term sustainability operations of zero fare service. And then the method, the calculator, if you will, to evaluate the costs and benefits of zero fare transit. That's not due until the following December. And we've taken on a consultant. It's a $300,000 study. That's a whole different ballpark than the one that we operate in and play in Vermont. I'm very appreciative to be part of this. And again, I'm hearing a lot of the same issues. People riding on the buses, rolling homeless shelters. The policy put in place in Burlington was if you got on the bus on a route, you had to get off that bus by the time it came back to that original place. And so they were just kind of monitoring the handful of folks who were on the bus for real no purpose other than a safe, warm a place to sit, no small service, but it's not what transit's intended for. This is something that should be disseminated throughout the nation in the next couple years, and I'm expecting we'll learn quite a bit from that analysis. And then, as I mentioned, taking a step back, zero fare is part of the funding of transit, but concurrent to asking the agency of transportation in Vermont, the legislature, really trying to figure out are we paying for transit services the right way? What are the other options? What are people doing around the country? And could we, introduce the scope that you see here, including the fare revenue impacts, to consider different ways to pay for transit. As I mentioned, we have our FTA formula funds, FHWA flex funds, which far exceed our formula dollars. And then we bring in state funds through our transportation bill, or T funds, I think most of us call them. And we know that fewer fuel purchases, higher gas economies, VMT, vehicle miles traveled, are down, electrification. Those are all putting pressures on those T funds. And so we want to be prepared to put in front of the legislature and this administration, all of whom support public transit, a couple options for them to consider as we look at, the principles of someone else pays versus we all pay a little. Right now, we ask towns to contribute to a route's cost if we have a bus shelter or a park and ride that we're using in their region or in their town. But we know that someone else is paying for that transit service if they're a town over and they just drive over to the park and ride and use that service. Is there a broader brush, more equitable way to fund transit? And certainly in Vermont, we only have a third of our Vermont towns that are served by a bus route. The rest all have access to demand response, whether it's the NEMT, Medicaid services, or our elderly and persons with disability program. We have a line item for those in recovery, another line item for job access. But we are using more demand response services and technologies like microtransit to try to do more for more people around the state. And with that, we all pay a little principle. It could expand rural services to the point where that we could provide that demand response service to anyone, almost a community rides or mobility for all approach for anybody who needs that dial-a-ride or demand response trip. We have 5 microtransit pilots that are being stood up right now, trying to figure out where that fits in. But regardless, we would need more money to match the federal dollars that we would apply for those statewide services. And we know that non-riders already pay for transit service because property taxes are being used to pay for town contributions, the T funds, those are our taxes from fees and gas taxes and the like. At the end of the day, we looked at these potential funding sources. If we could remove $8 or $9 million from T funds and bring in an extra $4 or $5 million to allow for us to match the non-federal need for demand response, then we could be having an equitable system across the state. And you can imagine these evaluation categories are very subjective. Stability of revenue is pretty good. Ease of implementation depends on who's implementing. Political feasibility, I haven't seen a new fee be too politically feasible in a while. What does it do with equity? Always a concern and always an issue, increasingly so in Vermont and around the country. And then as we looked at sales tax and the impacts of payroll taxes, the business revenue assessment, the way that they pay for transit service in France, for example, all had their pluses and minuses. The one that, as we went down the list, that had the most, maybe positive elements would be this utility fee for about $3 a month to be tacked on to household utility fees, maybe about $30, $40 on business commercial fees. We could generate enough funds to replace those T funds, allowing those to support the bridges and roads and planning and everything else that we do as an agency. And also grow our demand response services and stay fare free. So that's really where we are in Vermont. We don't know what's best. And what I am hoping is as we bring this information and these studies internally to our legislature, to the public, to our public transit providers, we can coalesce around a statewide model. And what's that going to look like? Well, we know that we'll be looking at those impacts. We know that we need to share that with the people who are holding the purse strings and overseeing our management of these programs. But then are we going to extend zero fare service into SFY 24, 25, and just kind of rip the Band-Aid off and just be zero fare and make that work? Or are we going to revert to the previous policies, allowing the regions to charge fares where they deem appropriate and not wait for somebody from the Montpelier area and a program manager like myself to dictate how they need to pay for their services? Or do we really bifurcate the program between the 5307 urban and 5311 rural service? In Burlington, we provide a lot of FHWA monies to them and capital assistance, planning assistance. As a result, you can live in Burlington and get around without a car in a reasonable way. That probably justifies a fare. In the rural services, we only have a few routes in these larger towns that make it very difficult to live without a car. Or if you need to live without a car, you're then bundled into the demand response services, which is really to provide essential shopping and medical care and needs. It's not to get everybody to where they want to get to whenever they need to get there. And so that is something that will reveal itself through these next months of conversations, discussions, and as we look at the study results. So that's it from Vermont, and happy to answer any questions that anybody may have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ross, for your presentation. Very interesting what's going on in Vermont, and that complements really what we're seeing in Stanislaus County here in California. And so I'd like to bring back Adam for this discussion for a brief amount of questions. So we just have a few minutes. So I guess my first question is as operators consider zero fare policies, and this is throughout the country, even in the world, what would you tell them to consider based on your own experience?
For me, Chad?
For either Ross or Adam, but if you want to start, Adam, please.
I think for sure you want to make sure that the rules of the bus are well communicated and that you have mechanisms in place to enforce those rules, whether it's be security or drivers, to keep the bus a pleasant place to be and to use. I think that's a key piece of providing the free fares is trying to prevent the unwelcome behavior on the bus that tends to come.
Yeah, and with Adam being an actual operator, I deferred to him. I wasn't aware of some of the negative implications of being zero fare when we first started embarking on that policy. And so, yes, to participate in these types of webinars, there's a growing amount of information out through APTA and CTAA and all of our organizations that we're part of. Do some research to begin with, but then certainly understand that this isn't a silver bullet where the goal would be, oh, let's increase ridership by 25%. If we reduce fares, that should do it. Not necessarily. Some areas maybe, but it's not a solution for ridership or overall service considerations. It's a small part of the overall operations.
Interesting. I know the safety and security issue is very important for a lot of people. Many people have experienced harassment on buses, and it's a very unpleasant experience. Turning to something that perhaps a different type of security and safety may be another issue is the paratransit discussion. As we're familiar, federal law mandates that paratransit fares can be no more than 2 times the regular fare. In addition, paratransit is very expensive to provide and requires significant subsidies from the government. How have your agencies been approaching paratransit, but also demand responsive transit services in this zero fare environment?
In Vermont, we have a payment system where the Department of Vermont Health Access, who oversees the Medicaid program, pays a per member per month fee for us to provide the trips that are eligible. As a result, it hasn't reduced the overall revenues into our system. That's been key. On ADA, like you had mentioned, Chad, our average demand response ADA trip could be $24, $25. And in Vermont, our fares, certainly outside of the urban area, are low. And so to get $1 or $2 on $24, $25 trip isn't an appreciable difference maker when you bring in the other factors, on-time performance and threshold through the door timing and those types of things. But it is good. It is something that needs to be better addressed as we look at these next round of studies.
The ridership for our paratransit system wasn't really affected by our free fares anyway. So because we're not offering free fares throughout the year, we actually just our free fares were only on fixed and commuter routes and not on our paratransit system. And we're able to do that and talks with FTA because of these free fare periods were just promotional, not a permanent fare structure or permanent change to the fares. So we're able to continue to charge our normal rate for the paratransit trips. If we were to do a permanent free fare system, say it's free year round for everybody, that would cause the paratransit system to be free as well. You can only be double the cost, right? So so we did that. We did that during COVID times. We were free on everything, including the paratransit system, but that has since stopped. We haven't seen a big increase in our paratransit service demand since COVID's kind of ended. We're back to pre-COVID ridership level stay, and the funding sources that we use to pay for those are the state federal sources, and that's working out okay.
And I know, yeah, one of the things that many people talk about is funding levels and making sure that those are more predictable and that they can more rely on those programs to be here now and in the future. That way it makes service planning a lot easier. Definitely have appreciated your presentations on this topic. Definitely found it interesting on some of the unintended consequences or unexpected things that have been seen regarding the homelessness issue and the bus conduct issue, but also how more people are using it for groceries and using it families coming together. Lots of very interesting things as agencies consider this. We're going to go on a break for about a half hour. We'll be back at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time or 12:30 Pacific. Until then, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time, Adam and Ross. I learned a lot from your presentations. We'll go ahead and start that break. Again, thank you so much for your time and for your energy spent on this presentations. Much appreciated. Okay, well, it is 3:30 p.m. Eastern, 12:30 Pacific, and we're back with the symposium. We will have a session that is a debate, first time here in our 3 years on the symposium, that is a debate on zero fare transit. Moderating this debate, we will have Andy Furillo from Caltrans Division of Rail and Mass Transportation, where he is the Strategic Management Liaison. Prior to coming to Caltrans, he worked for the U.S. Government Accountability Office. He volunteers in his free time on transit causes, such as for the YOLO bus system in YOLO County, California, and Davis Unitrans in Davis, California. He volunteers at the Sacramento Bike Kitchen. He also previously worked for the Mobility Lab, a transportation demand management organization based in the DC area. Andy has a bachelor's in political science from UC Berkeley and a master's in international affairs from UC San Diego. His passion for transit and rail comes from his time living in South Korea, where he was studying international politics and political science. So turning it over to you, Andy.
Thank you, Chad, and welcome to this exciting session that we have. So as you've heard throughout the day, transit funding and zero fare specifically is a trendy topic in the transit industry right now. We heard a couple of excellent examples of transit agencies that have implemented zero fare programs earlier with transit organizations with Stanislaus County here in California, as well as the state of Vermont. So we've heard a couple of examples, but now we want to just kind of dive more deeply into the nuances of zero fare policy and some of the pros and cons. Again, this is like a super complex issue because, as we've heard throughout the day, there are transit agencies that have a huge range of fare box recovery, ranging from some of the larger urban providers for whom fares are a major revenue stream. And if there's a disruption to fares, like there was during the pandemic, that can have a major impact on their finances, to smaller agencies that have much lower fare box recovery to the extent that it can be challenging to get them to install technology to make it easier to pay the fares, as we heard about from Jillian Gillette earlier today with some of the California integrated travel projects and some of the obstacles that program has had to overcome. So we have two experts here who will be diving into the nuances and complexities of this issue with Joshua Schenk, managing principal at InfraStrategies, who is a proponent of zero fare transit, as well as Greg Newmark, professor of regional and community planning at Kansas State University, who will be providing a more skeptical perspective of zero fare transit today. So Joshua will be our first presenter. So he, as I mentioned, is a managing principal at InfraStrategies, a transportation and financial advisory firm, where he leads a practice focused on innovation, strategic planning, and technology. He's also a senior fellow in the Institute of Transportation Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, as well as a research associate at the Mineta Transportation Institute. Prior to joining InfraStrategies in UCLA, Dr. Schenk was the first ever Chief Innovation Officer at the LA County Metropolitan Transit Authority, or LA Metro. Dr. Schenk previously served as president and CEO of the Eno Center for Transportation, a leading national transportation policy think tank based in Washington, D.C. So Josh, I turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to provide a quick overview of of some of the ideas behind why we might say yes to fareless. The idea of fareless transit, and I prefer to call it fareless rather than free or zero fare, largely because fareless indicates that it is not free. There is a cost to it, but the question is, do we want people to pay that cost at the fare box? And that's the question I'm going to speak to today. We did a good amount of research on this at LA Metro, and I've written some recent pieces about it. I can't say that I'm 100% on board with the idea of fareless for every system on Earth, but it's certainly something worth considering, and I'm going to talk about some of the benefits. So the first key point, and I think this is a reason a lot of people explore the idea of fareless, it has the potential to improve equity. There's a lot of talk about equity as a goal for transportation, for public transit, society in general, certainly here in Los Angeles and many other communities around the country. But actually taking action that improves equity often proves to be challenging, because what you're doing is effectively taking something away or taxing a wealthier group in order to help pay or improve the outcomes for a lower income group. And that's often not a politically easy thing to do, even in the most progressive environments. This is a way that it can often be done, and often a little more politically palatable than we see in other places. And that's because, in part, the existing transportation network is highly inequitable in most American cities, and people see that, right? If you have access to a vehicle, in most cities, you have a far greater number of jobs and activities that you can reach within a reasonable period of time compared to other alternatives. And that means that if you have no access to a car, your alternatives are highly limited. And reducing the burden on the folks who have no other alternative but to use public transit is a pretty direct way of improving equity. And it also can be a path to the idea of universal basic mobility, which means that transit or mobility is a basic human right that we fund through taxation, and that everyone is entitled to a certain basic level of it, whether it's transit or any other mode. That's a concept that is certainly growing in popularity. And if you use a progressive tax source that is aimed at higher income people, and in order to fund public transit, that's essentially a direct transfer of wealth, because the vast majority of people riding public transit in the US, in most cities, tend to be lower income. Not true in some of the largest cities where you see a greater mix, but in the most transit agencies, that is the case. And so this is a very progressive idea that could potentially improve equity. That's the top reason that people think about it. A second reason is that people are often thinking that this is a way to improve ridership, which is no surprise. When you make the cost of something direct to people zero, that will often increase demand for that product. And this is a quick way to do that for public transit. So if you're looking to increase ridership, eliminating fares is certainly a quick way. And in America, we like quick solutions. And this is a way to get more people on public transit. It also has the added benefits of potentially, if done effectively, improving safety in a couple of ways. One being that when more people are riding transit, this creates a more comfortable environment wherein people feel safer as more people on the train provide more eyes on the street, a la Jane Jacobs. And a second way that we found is that it reduces conflicts with operators. The number of people, at least at Metro, at LA Metro, and in many transit systems around the country, that do not pay fares today is very high. In fact, we calculated it may have been higher than 50% of the riders in LA Metro were not even bothering to pay the fare anyway. This means that operators of buses are often at the center of conflicts with riders about fare payment. And this is something that not only is dangerous for operators, but is certainly not their job. And so reducing those conflicts by getting rid of fares can reduce operator assaults, which are actually a pretty substantial problem in many transit systems. And then finally, fareless can be a way to increase ridership without necessarily increasing costs in many cases, because lots of transit agencies have some excess capacity in off-peak times. They're running more vehicles than necessarily needed. And so if you only apply fareless during off-peak times, this is a really simple way to increase ridership, improve equity, really with not much of an additional cost other than the foregone fare revenue, which may not even be that much in many cases because a lot of the revenue is collected during peak time. So that's one way that fareless can pretty inexpensively increase ridership. And then finally, fareless is a method by which you can take the first step towards congestion pricing. Now, I know congestion pricing is not something that people running for mayor may often tout, but it is certainly something that urban planners and other transportation economists love because we know that this is the way that we could actually reduce congestion, increase transit ridership, and reduce environmental pollution, all with one nice policy that is very tidy and works really well. Unfortunately, it is something that most cities are pretty terrified to put in place. But one thing that makes it more palatable, at least we found at LA Metro, is that if you pair it with free transit, it can be something that is more acceptable. We did that here in Los Angeles when we said we would look at the idea of congestion pricing in order to potentially enable a free transit system. That's why the board of LA Metro agreed to look at it. Now, looking at it is not the same as doing it. It's not been done yet, but at least this is a way of making the idea of congestion pricing more politically palatable because at least you're saying, hey, we're going to charge people to drive on the roads, but at least you'll be able to ride transit without paying. The current system where we have fares for transit almost everywhere and roads are free almost everywhere, it does seem a little backwards given what we're trying to accomplish, given the dangers of vehicles, given the pollution from vehicles, and given the inequity caused by a society dominated by vehicles. It seems like it probably should be the opposite, wherein we charge people to drive on the roads and we make transit fareless. And that is the first step towards that could be potentially getting rid of fares on transit. So until we have a tremendous amount of political will for road pricing, it might be easier to use a lot of carrots, such as free transit, that's a typo there, but incentives for alternatives to driving alone that can be potentially very effective. So those are my main ideas, and I look forward to hearing what Greg has to say. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Schenk. That was a great presentation. So now I hand it over to Greg Newmark, who is an associate research professor of civil engineering at Kansas State University and is particularly interested in the provision and management of public transit services, having previously worked at Chicago's Regional Transportation Authority. Dr. Newmark's research emphasizes the innovative use of data to understand public transportation, as well as the collection of those data. Currently, he's working with the Transportation Secure Data Center to build an archive of onboard survey data from transit systems across the country. And he welcomes you to reach out to him at gnewmark@ksu.edu to share your rider survey data. And I'll also add that Dr. Newmark was part of our Symposium steering committee and was instrumental in helping us identify and recruit speakers and organize this event. So we thank him for that. And now I turn it over to Greg.
Great. Thanks, Andy. So as Joshua said, and I feel similarly, I don't disagree with what he just presented in most cases, but I come to different conclusions, while still kind of agreeing. So let me just say, kind of give my general thinking, and then kind of my 3 points, my con points. And I feel a little awkward being kind of the Grinch in this situation of being the against free transit take, but I do think that just having this conversation is really important because the issue has become so resonant in so many different types of communities and also so many elections and mayoral elections. So I guess I come at this with a slightly different take, which is the public policy goal that I see that is critical is not to provide basic mobility, but to provide access to opportunities. And from my perspective, the accessibility is largely determined by our land use choices, which have been built around, supporting cars mostly, but also, lots of unusual or problematic zoning decisions, also lots of uh, bias in terms of housing policies towards different groups. So I think that given that we've set up a world that is not accessible, it's not fair to put all the restorative burden onto transit. So that's the take. My main thing or approach is that we need a more accessible world. We have created, at least in the U.S., a situation that is not accessible by land use policies that demonstrate bias and favor social bias and also favor travel by cars with the attendant roads and parkings and large lots and stuff, and that we can't fix all of that with free fares. That said, I think that transit fare policy, like transit systems in general, are really contextual based on the community. And so, as many other speakers, starting with Professor Taylor earlier today, have said that the transit system in that the BART that serves the downtown San Francisco job-rich, tech-rich area, it's very different from some of the more peripheral transit systems, even within the Bay Area. And where I'm, from my perspective here in Manhattan, Kansas, where there's 4 bus lines on hour frequencies or headways, the with very, very low fare box recovery ratios, it's really a different, situation and different discussion, I think, about making transit, as Joshua said, fare free. Now, I should also say that I was very influenced as a student by my initial dissertation advisor, Marty Wax of blessed memory, who really emphasized the idea that we should charge people for their goods according to their impacts to society. And so marginal social cost pricing, kind of plays into my thinking about how we should charge people for transit. And on the flip side, I also find the kind of Rawlsian principle that if we were going to, design an ideal kind of world and not knowing our eventual place in it, we'd want everything to be, kind of fair and just. But also, if it's going to be unjust, we'd like it to be to support the weakest members of society, the most disadvantaged members of that society. So that's another, part I kind of bring to my thinking. And then lastly, and this builds on Jillian's presentation, I think nicely, I think the future of fare collection in general is going to be pretty, not really holding things up. I should say the past also, with tokens or flash passes was also, pretty efficient. But as we move towards cashless, contactless cards, pretty universally, I think that, the money handling issues are going to disappear. So I'm assuming that's going to happen. So with that all said, my first point, my con number 1 is that fares modulate demand. Fares provide one of the best tools that we have to adjust the ridership to our service. And again, this is from the perspective of a system that has a big peak period flux that really strains the system. So in major cities, the whole system is geared to accommodate the peak. And so you buy enough vehicles and hire enough drivers in order to accommodate the peak. And then they basically, are providing service, for the rest of the day. I don't want to say for free, but the costs are much less. So if you can reduce the demand during the peak by, say, peak period pricing, then you can manage the supply and demand better and drastically reduce your build out costs. So if you give up free fares universally, then that's a problem. Now, if you just do it during off-peak times, that makes lots of sense, and I'd support that. So I'm showing a slide that on the top this is a platform at Grand Central Station, a commuter rail platform, and I then covered the bottom with a slide that I show in my classes. This is just an old bus, pricing guide from King County Metro in Seattle, and I think it's a great slide because it shows lots of fare variation by distance, by time of day, for different age groups, for different concessionary categories, unusual things on the weekend, and all of these, benefits to try to manage demand and kind of goose ridership, disappear if we completely remove fares. Now, if it is, more subtle, like they're suggesting here in King County, then maybe it's not as problematic. The other issue that a number of our speakers, particularly Adam and Ross today, touched on is that the security concerns, and it does seem that that people that are going to cause problems on transit don't like to pay fares. So when there are crackdowns on fare evasion, crime rates on transit do go down. But there's also questions of, are crackdowns on fare evasions targeted at certain populations, and how can that be kind of fairly done? And to Joshua's point, how can that be done in a way that doesn't put a bus driver at risk? So, it makes more sense in a transit station, in a rail station. It's more complicated on a bus. But from my perspective, pricing is a really important tool for managing a transit system, and you don't want to give that up. And it also, is not just about managing the demand, but it's also about, keeping the system safe. All right, so the other thing, and this is more of a small point, but I think it's important, that fares signal transit's value to riders. That we tend to take care of things that we value, and we don't always value things that are free. And so the example that I often use are like swag. My father-in-law has like just he cannot say no to pens, and so he has like mugs and mugs and mugs and mugs of pens that he's picked up at conferences, many of which don't work. They're just like like all over his office, to the point that since they don't work so much, he then bought a whole bunch of pens in addition. So my point is that when we pay for things, we value them more, and I think that incorporating fares sends a signal that transit is something that we value, and therefore riders, care a tad more. And if I'm getting a concessionary fare, or it's free for me because I am a senior or a veteran, or I didn't have enough money, the bus driver let me on generously, then I appreciate that I'm getting a deal, and I value that rather than assuming that that deal will always be there. And then lastly, and this slide might actually kind of be undoing my case, but I'm in the middle of a research project with a colleague and a student, and we're trying to take NCD data and kind of make it more meaningful and useful. And so the top graph on the left, on the y-axis, shows efficiency, and we're measuring efficiency as the person miles traveled divided by the vehicle miles traveled. So or vehicle miles provided. So it's basically the load factor at any given time. So if you were to like look at the average load on a vehicle in that system, what would the load be? What are the number of people on that vehicle? And I should say that we did this not for specific systems, but for the entire UZA, for the urbanized areas. So we're not just cherry picking BART and not looking at, say, less effective transit agencies, but we are picking the entire region that the federal government views as a single, transit zone. And what you can see, kind of to our surprise, is that as you subsidize transit more, it ends up getting more efficient, right? Like you might assume that subsidies lead to inefficiencies, because we just put buses everywhere, and but in fact, we were surprised to see this. I should also add that the subsidy measure is subsidy per resident of the UZA, not just a gross number. So this would suggest that subsidizing is good, and maybe no fares would also be good. But when you look at how much revenues are generated by the different systems, and now, so I'm changing the y-axis but keeping the x-axis the same, you can see that the same leaders, so New York, San Francisco, Boston, Seattle, are still in the top tier of generating revenue. Seattle bumps up, Chicago kind of drops a little bit, LA is interesting in that there's a relatively high subsidy with relatively low directly generated revenue, but it has a high efficiency. So, perhaps in certain situations, um, even without generating a lot of revenues, you can be efficient. But our thinking is that um, generating revenues is actually a really important market signal to transit operators about running their services. And so losing that data is problematic. So my other kind of points I wanted with this slide is that when you have a system that is bringing in money, you can cross subsidize other services, and you're gaining information that you can use to inform your policies. And then lastly, from an equity perspective, um, fares are not inherently inequitable. They can facilitate both an ability to pay or a benefits received kind of equity strategy, particularly if there are adjustments made for people that can pay more, people that can pay less. And then lastly, there's so much money that fares bring in major systems that losing that is a substantial, cost to society. On the flip side, in Manhattan, Kansas, where I live, where less than 10% of the cost running system is made up by the fare box, then it's a really different case. So anyway, so those were my thoughts. I'm from Cincinnati. This is a slide of back when there used to be a more balanced set of transportation options and transit options, and that's what I think we need to get back to. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg, and thanks for that excellent presentation. So now we've heard two very strong arguments for different perspectives on zero fare or fareless transit. So now we'd like to give our two experts some time for rebuttals against the other's arguments. So I'd like to turn it over to Josh, who will be first in doing that.
All right, thanks. I think, Greg, you're still sharing your screen, which is
Oh,
fine.
sorry. Let me stop. Hang on.
But so not surprisingly, Greg and I agree a lot more than we disagree. So this idea of a debate here may be limited, but I'll try to pick out some points where we do have a slight difference of opinion. Although even then I think it's not as big as you might want for a discussion like this. I think that it's really absolutely what Greg said about putting the burden on transit for fixing all of the challenges with all of our policies is absolutely unfair. And certainly free fares are not going to solve all of those challenges. The question is, what can they fix? Can they solve some portion of that large challenge? And I would argue that they can, in that one of the large challenges right now is this idea of inequity in the transportation system. And no, they're not going to solve that entirely either, but they can make some inroads on it. And it's a policy that has proven more popular than a lot of the other more challenging things that, of course, I think Greg and I would both agree need to be done. And then on the idea of marginal social cost pricing, which is also something I strongly believe in and would love to see on transit. And I will agree to the idea that it should be on transit when it is on roads. And I think Marty Wax would also be on the same page on that. I would just say, as long as we don't have it on roads, then I don't see how we can have it on transit. Roads are creating, the lack of marginal social cost pricing on roads is creating far more problems in urban areas than transit fares are fixing. That's for sure. So on the larger point of fares modulating demand, I think we're both on the same page on this one. I mean, we agree that off-peak fareless could be a place to experiment, could make some sense, may not necessarily be an issue, could be an improvement as far as spreading out the demand curve. But I would note that transit is suffering right now as a result of COVID and the huge change in people's travel patterns that we've seen. So I don't know that modulating demand is the biggest concern that I'd have on most transit systems at the moment. Now that said, you don't want to make everything free and then people come back and all of a sudden you're liable for a huge cost, and it's going to be very difficult to reverse that decision. So I can understand the reticence, but nonetheless, for agencies where perhaps fare revenue isn't a huge part of what they need to survive, and where ridership is way down, this could be a way to improve ridership, and modulating demand is not going to be an issue there. And as far as the security issue, I mean, I think we both said similar things on that. I guess the only slight disagreement is that I feel like when I was at Metro, and our security people would say, well, we need the fare so that we can get rid of people on the system who aren't paying, or we can reduce crime. I always felt like there's got to be a better way to reduce crime than to require the people who can't afford $1.75 to pay for the system. So I'm not a security expert, and I don't pretend to know the answer, but I would like to believe that there is a way we can improve security without having to put the burden on low-income people to pay for the transit system. And on the issue of fares signaling value, I think there's some truth to that. But I would point out that many of the social services we enjoy as a society do not charge fares. We don't charge fares for libraries unless you don't return the books on time. And even then, I'm not sure how strictly those are enforced. Or parks, fire stations. I mean, none of these things are things that people have to pay for on a per use basis. They're just considered things that we all have access to, and we all use and hopefully enjoy. Transit could be considered the same type of thing. I know that it's not exactly the same. There are, of course, differences, but I think people value parks and libraries in many, many communities, despite the fact that they don't charge a fare. And then finally, on the last point about signaling a value to the larger society, I mean, I think if I understand Greg's larger point there, it's that without the signal of fair revenue, it can be difficult to measure what you're achieving. And that may be true, but there, of course, is other data that we can use, ridership data being one. But one that I'd like to see more of is customer satisfaction data. Many transit agencies are slow to get to that one, but most places that deliver goods to customers or services to customers tend to measure whether their customers are satisfied with that, and then use that as a basis for how they can improve. And I think that's a preferred method to charging people. And then finally, just the idea that this is a major source of revenue for, I'm not blind to the fact that many transit systems are struggling right now financially, in part because ridership is down. And if you made them fareless, then in the absence of any other policy change, they would all be going out of business pretty quickly. I'm not suggesting that as a solution, obviously. What I am suggesting is that the question of who is paying for these transit systems is a fair one, FAIR, to raise. And right now, most transit systems that are relying on revenue for a large portion of the fare box, that means that a lot of low-income people are responsible for paying and funding these transit systems. And I'm just suggesting that perhaps that's not the best way for society to fund transit. Perhaps there is a more equitable way to fund it. And we can think about whether fareless can be a part of a larger package of policy changes wherein we fund transit through more equitable means. So those are my thoughts.
Yeah. So just to kind of go in reverse, I very much agree that we need a suite of things to fund transit, and so I am resistant to fareless as a silver bullet. I think that the alternatives, like transit needs to look good, and so charging for alternatives will make transit look better. And that brings us, I think, nicely to the congestion pricing topic, which does pair nicely, with transit. And the I wrote a paper about this called "Hot for Transit," about hot lanes in transit, that I'm only sharing because The title is among my better ones, and but I would love people to read it. And what I found is not unlike what Joshua said, that it essentially, when we start charging for road space, that opens up some options for transit, both in terms of direct funding for transit on the roads and to move people out of their cars and onto transit. And there are places like between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv where the one option is there's a hot lane, there's a congestion price lane, but other people just get into a bus and the bus will be for free. But in practice, that is subsidizing the wealthiest people or relatively wealthy people that already own cars. Um, and it does encourage them to get off the road, which isn't bad. And it allows people that are willing to pay to drive. But I think that it ends up in some ways being, free transit for the wealthiest, which is not a reason not to do it. But I think that some of the equity trade-offs that we're thinking about are not as, is clear cut. So, for example, depending on how transit is subsidized locally and federally, it could be in fact that it is, being progressively funded. Um, I think that the idea of different populations and kind of deep discount, pricing is another way to kind of inch into perhaps a free fare-like system um, that that still involves fares and still and maybe offers better equity benefits. So, for example, if like many universities that either have direct deals with a trans agency or through student fees, kind of collectively purchase transit passes, only a few of which get used to any extent, unfortunately, that provides a fare free experience for the people that are part of that class while still yielding lots of revenues for the trans agency without officially kind of stepping off the idea that are fares, and that might also be a way to better handle equity and more directly handle equity. And of course, in California, there's nice examples of, uh, and other places, but housing developments and stuff that offer transit as a benefit of living there. Also, those are usually tied to reduced parking allotments. So I think more use of creative ways to get more fares into the system and to reduce the perhaps the fare burden on individuals is a way to more directly deal with equity rather than just kind of writing off fares. So I'd like to see more creativity and more nuance there. Um, in terms of the ridership, I just desperately want more people to use transit, um, and I'm not sure that, and as other speakers have said, I'm not sure that reducing fares is really the draw, but I would rather see improved services. So I'm definitely a fan of less coverage, better service, where there's a set of routes and spaces in a community where you can live without a car, that transit is good, reliable, and frequent. Um, and I would, rather we create a situation that is, that ridership is drawn because you can live a life on transit rather than one that is, kind of, there's lots of uh, kind of coverage, but the service is bad, but it's free. And I think that that's a little bit of what I see here in Manhattan, where transit's essentially free to half the community that is tied to university, and it is really undersubscribed, painfully so. Um, oh, but the reducing conflicts, I think that this is a really important issue that some of the like more nuanced fare policies like um, congestion pricing or peak period pricing in Chicago went down in flames, I don't know, 25 years ago because of the conflicts with riders, where a rider would be like, well, you were supposed to be here 5 minutes ago, and now I have to pay more because you were slow. That's not fair. And the riders were like, look, I don't want to deal with this. And so flat fares just made things, easy. But if we, viewed it differently and it was, really just automated contactless cards and we accommodated using GTFS schedule data, not the real-time data. And, if the person was if the bus was supposed to be there at that time and it didn't arrive at that time, it should still, charge that original price. I think that would be a way to, return a lot of this variation in a way that minimizes conflicts with drivers. And, uh, and for sure, I'm definitely coming at this with a perspective of someone who last actively rode transit in a city with a robust transit system in a pre-COVID period. And so I have to say that I'm literally living in the middle of Kansas. So I am not, my finger is not on the pulse of, what's going on today, although Brian Taylor thought presented well. And so I think Joshua's point is really good that in this current moment, maybe, really mixing things up is essential. I'm just nervous about giving up one of the main tools for managing the system.
Thank you so much for both of you for those excellent rebuttals. So it looks like we have about 5 minutes left for this session. So I would like to ask one question on an interesting aspect of this issue that we've heard both during this discussion as well as during our sessions earlier today. And that is that overall funding for transit, and especially for transit operations, is quite constrained. On the operating side of things, you have a lot of the federal and state funding sources. The ability to use those for operations is restricted in a lot of cases, meaning that historically fares are one of the more popular funding sources for funding actual operation of transit service. So my question for you two is that when in a constrained funding environment, what factors should transit agencies consider when deciding to use those available operating funds to improve on the services they have, or instead subsidizing the ability to reduce or go to fareless transit? So what are some factors they should consider there, both in terms of using the funds they have and as they seek to build political support for obtaining additional operating funds? Again, versus that providing more service versus subsidizing the fares.
Well, I mean, and I think this is often brought up and Greg brought it up as well, that if you focus on reducing fares or making transit fareless, then you aren't focusing on the bigger priority of improving the service. And I agree that improving the service is the bigger priority. Where I get lost in this, though, is that I don't see it as either or, because I don't think funding is the biggest barrier to better service for transit. A lot of the problems with transit service are not due to a lack of funding. In our case in Los Angeles, one of the biggest barriers is a lack of operators. We've got plenty of money if we could just hire more of them. Also, another big barrier is the challenge of inflexibility of route systems. It's very difficult to change routes in response to demand. It's difficult to put an on-demand transit. It's difficult to put transit frequently where people will actually want to go because of all the political pressure to have coverage, as Greg alluded to. So I would put the funds towards fareless and figure out a way to use existing funds to operate a better system. That's how I would make that trade-off.
I mean, I think I said this before, but I think that I definitely believe that we should be more judicious about where we offer transit and expectations of transit, and that is flying in the face of a lot of political headwinds, which I can do because I'm sitting, at university. But an expectation for corridors of accessibility and opportunity and corridors of not is, I think, important. And it could be improving the expectations of service standards, like the I always forget the name of the manual, but like having a maybe a more established set of standards. But it is difficult. I want to touch on one point that Joshua made, though, and a plug for my project. Transit agencies do collect customer satisfaction data through surveys. And this data is, as Joshua alluded to, not well used, right? Like they spend, depending on the system, millions of dollars collecting this data on an annual basis. And so what I'm trying to do is build this repository to make that available to everyone. And there's lots of questions, even in the collecting of data. Is it done in a way that accurately reflects, the user base? Where you survey, how you weight things could really skew perceptions. But we need more research on this to make it meaningful. And so if people are watching transit agencies, I am collecting this data. Please reach out to me. End of plug. But I agree with Joshua that we need different metrics for how we're doing. not just, the money that we're making or the ridership.
Thank you, Greg. And with that, it looks like it is about 1:15 p.m. Pacific time, so that brings us to the end of this session. But I'd like to thank Josh and Greg for devoting their time to this and sharing their perspectives on this important and timely issue. So really appreciate that. And now I'd like to hand it back to Chad Riding for a brief wrap-up message, as well as a preview of our sessions tomorrow.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Greg. Very interesting session. Really enjoyed your arguments for and against zero fare transit or fareless transit, whichever term you'd prefer. We have a great sessions coming up tomorrow. We have our plenary address from Arndt Betzner, a Switzerland-based professional, transit strategist and member of the board of directors of Mobility Genossenschaft and Clarine AG, and Mary Leary, who is the over the Office of Research at Federal Transit Administration. We also have sessions on electrification and emissions reduction, on transit resiliency, and on public health and transit. So we're looking forward to the next 2 days of great sessions, great discussions. And so please let us know if you have any questions. Remember Greg's research if you're a transit provider to forward that information on to him. So very thankful to all of our presenters and moderators today. And we'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow at 12 p.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. Thank you.